Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Wow. Well, it's wonderful to be here this morning. The energy is fabulous. I have been to all of your school districts and several of the schools that are represented here today. As superintendent, I was privileged to visit all 58 counties. So I've been to Loyalton and Likely and Hayfork, as well as San Bernardino and Los Angeles. I've never met a child that didn't lift me up. It's the grown-ups I worry about sometimes, but not this morning. And certainly, I want to give a shout out to Sunny McPeak and her amazing team who are doing this really important work. You know, we are living in a time where people are somewhat feckless about this issue of education. I mean, I won't say anything disparaging about our Secretary of Education, who I think if she had shown up for a job interview at either a nonprofit like United Way or at a corporation like AT&T, and she knew as little about the enterprise she was suggesting she should lead, she would have been laughed out of the room. So what we have to do, though, is we have to be more certain than ever before that we are standing for and with the children. And then we have got to stay together. We cannot let education divide itself anymore. It can't be about the preschool versus K-12, and it can't be about K-12 versus higher ed, and it can't be the community colleges fighting against CSU or UC. I like to say if I gave you 28 pencils one at a time, virtually everybody in this room could break them. But the strongest person in this room cannot break 28 pencils if we put them together. It's just too hard. So we've got to stand together for education, for all the children. And there's a lot of important work that's being done, but nothing is more important than this conversation about closing the achievement gap and the digital divide. Because that needs to become job one in California. We cannot have these kids in 1950s classroom settings. That isn't who we are. We can do better than that. The global economy has fundamentally changed the importance of education. It's always been important. Those people coming out of a civil war decided to do an amazing thing. They decided to have compulsory public education. One of the first countries on earth to say that we should educate all of the children. And it was a little sketchy in the beginning, but it was life-changing. And when you think about the information age and globalization, it has not only changed the requirements for an individual's career, it has raised the educational requirement for successful school districts, successful counties, and successful states like California. We have got to be clear that I spent a wonderful day yesterday at Curtis here in San Bernardino County. So Curtis Middle School, wow. What a great day it was. And here, what did I find there? I found a great principal. And I have to say that Marlene Bayakondova, I wish she was here today. She's not here, is she? Did I miss her? She's a rock star. And honestly, she and her teachers and her staff and her students were all together. They were all on the same page for STEM education. And they were excited and unified. And they were positive and they were optimistic. And so what a great day for me. And I will just tell you that as we are going around the state, we have got to do more building schools like Curtis and like the schools that you represent here. I've been to some of the other schools, Crozier. I was at Crozier last year, and I've really had an opportunity to be uplifted by all of you. But I'll also tell you, I do read the TIM study. You know, TIM stands for Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study. And you know what they found? They found in the highest performing nations, and they were diverse, from Finland to Singapore. Very different parts of the world, very different approaches, and yet similar approaches in the sense that high-performing countries have coherence. Everybody's on the same page. Everybody's on a team together, working for the future of those kids. Singapore is a fascinating example because they turned their education program around in one generation. And we can do that again. The reality is, when we talk about world-class standards, I want to just say, there's nothing wrong with having standards for our kids. That's not evil. Every major corporate company in the world has its own internal standards. Every major country has education standards. The problem is they can't be just about memorization. This is not about memorization. This is about using information. And so at the end of the day, we have to make sure that the highest performing countries which understand this include the United States. It is not about multiple choice exams to effectively measure performance, but demonstrated ability to think and write and analyze, work in groups, find defects. And that's what I saw at Curtis. Kids are looking to find what works, what doesn't work, and to build on their knowledge about STEM to actually do productive, performance. I will just tell you, and the other thing that we need to notice, and by the way, you should know that in the TIMSS study, there is a group of California and American kids that's above average in the world. We're below average overall, but there's a group of kids that are above average, and that's the public schools with less than 10%, with at least 10%, but less than 50% of students eligible for free and reduced lunch. It is the schools that have over 75% kids on free and reduced lunch that are below average on the TIMSS study. And that is what we must focus on like a laser. Let me just tell you all, I know local control funding formula has given us some additional options at our lower performing schools, but it is simply not enough. The state is fundamentally underinvested in all schools. We are in the bottom 10 of the 50 states in per pupil spending and the top 10 of the 50 states in per prisoner expenditure. And ladies and gentlemen, budgets are statements of values. That is not the value that I know any American who holds. Even the correctional peace officers I've met don't think it's a good idea that we would starve schools. Because they know the best crime prevention program is a good education. And the economists know the best economic development program is a good education. And everyone else who does important work knows the best way we can advance this state and this society and these children is to focus on their education. So I want to just say that in the highest performing countries, what we know is teachers feel valued. And I want to just give a shout out to every teacher in this room because you are teacher leaders. And for too long, we have not lifted up the teachers of California. If I hear somebody else complain about the teachers, I'm going to pull my hair out. You know our teachers have the largest class size in the United States of America. Did you know we have not only the highest number of poor children, but the highest percentage of poor children? A quarter of a century ago, only 1 in 10 children was in the poverty level. Now it is 25%. So the fact that we have more poor children than anyone else in numbers and in percentage means we should be investing more in education, not only for the poor children, but for every child, because we cannot allow this to become a contest where we're playing off each other. So I'm for LCFF, but it is fundamentally underfunded, and so is the rest of education, and somebody needs to wake up and smell the coffee and reinvest in education. Go look at the state constitution, Article 16, Section 8. These people take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the state of California and the Constitution of the United States. You know what Article 16, Section 8 says? From all revenues, the state shall first set aside the money for the education of children through institutions of higher education. But as much as it's important that we have great teachers, it's really important that we have great principals. Principals have to be instructional leaders who are empowered to focus on instruction every minute of every day. You know, the truth is, when I first went to the National Institute of School Leadership, we were in Jacksonville, Florida, and Florida's different than California in the sense that they only have as many districts as they have counties. Every county is a district. Now that seems weird in California because our counties have so many people in them. Like, remember there are, as Sonny pointed out, there are more students in LA Unified than there are people in North Dakota. I know you spent a year there one night, but seriously, we don't realize the scale of California. One time the Wyoming superintendent said, "Oh my God, Elaine, you're so lucky that you're not growing. I think all of your kids are moving out of California and they're moving to Wyoming. We're just adding kids in leaps and bounds." And I said, well, Judy, and Judy Catchpole, she was actually a really nice person. And I said, well, Judy, we are losing some students, but we're gaining some students too. So what's happening is our rate of growth isn't as large as it used to be, but we're still adding students. And she said, oh, how many did you add last year? I said, well, last year, it was 86,000. The year before it was 110,000. The year before that was 140,000 because we did class size reduction in K3, and a lot of people that would have put their kids in private schools or in other kinds of situations put them in public schools. She said, oh my God, 140,000, where did you put them? Her whole state had 86,000 students in it, which was the number we added that year. So when you think about the scale of California, we really do need great principals to help our great teachers. And the fact is, principals need to build organizational systems in which everyone at the school site takes ownership. Great principals focus on educational leadership. And that's what I saw at Curtis and at Crozier and at the other schools that I have visited that are here today. The truth is, I visited over 600 schools in the state of California as superintendent. I never went to a great school that didn't have a great principal. And I never went to a great school district that didn't have a great superintendent. But that means they are focused on instruction. So when we went to Florida and we had 60-something principals that were going to go through the National Institute for School Leadership Training, and we asked them to keep track of their time during the week. And they knew we were focused on instructional leadership. We asked them to keep track of where they spent their time. There was only one principal who spent over 15% of her time on instructional leadership. The rest were worried about discipline and site maintenance and a bunch of things that are really not job one. So here's one of the things I learned in the private sector. They had us do a exercise. Take everything in your inbox, put it in an A pile, the most important, a B pile, somewhat important, a C pile, the least important. Then go through your B pile and decide, is it really an A, really important, or really a C, unimportant? Then throw out your C pile, because that's the one you'll be tempted to do every time. Because it's the low-hanging fruit. It's the stuff I'm going to get out of the way before I get to my A pile. But you've got to get to your A pile, because that's really where the substantive work is. That's where job one is. So I will tell you that too often in America, principals do not have or do not feel they have control. I think that the fact that you are here today, that you're able to work in partnership with each other across schools, across districts, with your staffs and with your district office staff is really important, because highly effective principals like leaders in the military and leaders in successful businesses have the authority to take responsibility. And authority is something that principals must feel that they are in control and that there is a sense of teamwork and purpose at the site. And I'll be honest with you, for too long, federal and state accountability systems have suggested that we really hold these principals as responsible for student outcomes. But principals frequently say they are not empowered to focus on student outcomes. That's why this framework that you are working with of school to home is important, because it does give you a much better way to focus on high expectations for children. You know, the old saying, it's better to set your sights too high and miss them than set them too low and hit them. We've got to have high expectations for these children. But too often principals tell me they lack financial resources. What I loved at Curtis was they actually were getting part of the LCFF money to do their STEM education, to buy the equipment that allowed these kids to move forward. Too often principals tell me there are low expectations for students. Well, you really can't expect much. These kids are in poverty. Well, you know, guess what? There's a lot of kids that came out of poverty, and some of them are sitting in this room who got great educations and then have had wonderful lives. You're talking to the machinist's daughter here. Dress clerk was my mother. And I had a great education, and I've had a wonderful life. So I will just tell you, we have to make sure, though, that principals feel that their faculty has the capability, and they do. It's just that too often they're not treated like they're members of a team. What is the word teachers often use to identify their situation? It's isolation. So that's why it's important that you learn to work together as members of the same team. And of course, principals complain they have lack of authority to get the job done and not enough time to be instructional leaders. So we need a strategy for developing the kind of coherence that is found in the most high-performing countries. And we need a new generation of school leaders who will, in fact, believe everything is possible, and that will, in fact, look like this room. Because there's a diversity in this room, you notice? And that's California. That's who we are. In the end of the day, whether it's a high-performing state like Connecticut or a high-performing country like Singapore or Finland, we need to have a capacity-building model. And in my view, that's part of the reason you are here today, because you have things to teach each other and to share with one another. I have to say that changes occurred in business management. All the jobs were moving offshore, and business looked around in the 80s and they said, wow, a lot of jobs are leaving America. What are we going to do? And so there was a sea change that occurred in American business, and they did in fact change their business schools, because a lot of corporations were starting to use their executives to train people. So the business schools changed, and now guess what? Schools of education are changing. When I was superintendent, I begged UC to either fish or cut bait, either offer EDDs for people that didn't want to be professors but wanted to be school leaders like principals and like superintendents, or let the state university system do it. Too many of the University of California campuses essentially told me, I actually was invited by a wonderful guy who was chancellor at Riverside. He invited me to come down and talk to his School of Education. And I went in there, and it was I have to tell you, it was mostly white men. And I told them I really needed an EDD program so that we could train a new generation of principals and superintendents about leadership for the future. And I needed not just the PhD, that was important, but I needed the EDD. You should have seen the body language in the room. Almost all white men. And I had the chancellor of Riverside, UC Riverside, with me, and I had the head of the School of Education, who I'd known, he'd been at Stanford, worked with me. So I was thrilled. I have the chancellor and I have the dean of the school, and I have a bunch of people with their arms crossed looking resistant. And so, I said, so we need to have evening classes, and we need to have Saturday classes, because we have working professionals who are in the classrooms and or working as assistant principals, but they need more scaffolding to help them learn. And one of the professors said, let me see if I understand this. You want us to bring a bunch of 30-something, 40-something, or God forbid, 50-something-year-old students into our school and work on the evenings and weekends? No, we want a bunch of 20-somethings that want to be professors just like us. Well, guess what? That changed. Mills College, where I worked, that was one of the reasons I was invited. They were one of the first to do an EDD, and they did it in evenings and weekends. And a bunch of other a bunch of other professors, and convinced their schools of education, because there were also some county offices like Sac County that started offering MAs and PhDs in education, or EDDs in education, because they had people that didn't want to commute far distances but wanted to get the training they needed to be school leaders. So I have to tell you that I think we have to take the time to learn to work as a team. And that's really what this is about. But it's also the time to learn from other teams that are represented here today. But we have to develop a sense of urgency about what we are doing. Time is a wasting. And the absolute importance of school leaders cannot be diminished any longer. We have to have people leading these schools, in fact, leading these educational teams, who are building and maintaining a standards-based instructional system, but one that's nimble, that's interesting, that's exciting, that the kids really want to do. These kids were on fire to do science, technology, engineering, mathematics. You know them. They want to be they want to be doctors. They want to be professors. They want to be educators. They want to be the future. But they have to have us believing in them and creating a learning environment so that teachers are supported in providing the type of instructional leadership that demands excellence in literacy, yes, but also in mathematics, in the arts. 25% of the jobs in the new economy are based in art. We need to understand that this is not. And by the way, when I had my arts task force, I like to keep them under 20. I did an arts task force. I had all these people demanding they be on the task force. It wasn't just the museums and the artists and the art galleries and the university art departments, music departments. It was Silicon Valley, because the software industry needs artists. It was the motion picture industry, because they need kids steeped in the arts. This is not crazy. This is absolutely who we're going to be in the future. In fact, the number is probably over 25%. So one of the things we know is that we have to design a learning environment such that teachers are supported in providing the kind of instructional leadership that does provide this kind of scaffolding. And beyond that, we have to begin to say that we're going to give principals more authority over the budget, over the staffing, over what they do and how they do it. Because I will tell you right now, and I want to tell you, nobody is more important to me than great teachers. I always say there's no job in America that's more important than that of a teacher. But it's also important to have wonderful principals. And right now we have a shortage in both. There is a terrible, terrible teacher shortage. And why? Well, I think the slogan that should be applied here is the floggings will continue until morale improves. We have belittled teachers and we have belittled principals for so long and limited their ability to make the decisions and move the needle, and then we're wondering why nobody wants to do this job. Well, guess what? This is the most important work we could be doing. It's every bit as important as any corporation, and it's every bit as important as any general or admiral you've ever met. So I'm here to tell you, our goal has to be, though, to change the training model for principals, to incorporate the best practices of other entities. And that is why it's important that you have taken the time to be here today, to share with each other, to learn from each other, to talk to each other, and to be thinking about what you do when you go home in this cloudy, rainy month of February to inspire and uplift those who you work with to move the ball for us. Because I will also say, I really do believe we have to move out of the bottom 10 of the 50 states in per pupil investment. If Prop 55 hadn't passed, we might have dropped back to 50th when the Prop 30 money ran out. So we have a window, but we have to stop the people in Sacramento from doing the shell game, because they have intentionally moved money out of the Prop 98 guarantee. They have excuses, it's a shell game. 1 minute they're taking out child development, and then they lower the amount of money in child development, then they put it back in the Prop 98 guarantee, so it pulls down the number. And we have other, Jerry Brown said he was going to restore the money he'd taken out of child development. $1 billion was taken, and we were supposed to get $230 million back this year, and it's the 0 to 5 kids that need it the most. That's the steepest curve of learning in your life. So for us to say, we're taking $230 million, we'll still owe it to you, but we're going to defer paying you. So what do you say to the 4-year-old? Would you please defer development for a year? No, they don't defer. They just don't develop as well as they would have if we had given them that opportunity. It is a shame and a disgrace that we are not supporting preschool, child development, and K-12. And by the way, kindergarten should be mandatory, and it should be full day. It's outrageous that it is not. But I want to just say, we do need, in fact, to have a model for school districts that play a major role in determining who will be our leaders and what leadership training they will work on and what are the major action projects. And ideally, districts will provide faculty with mentors. And that's why it's important that you're here at School to Home. Because this is an opportunity, yes, for you to share, but for you to think about what we can do in the future to make sure that we've got the tools in your toolbox to get things done. And so you're incorporating technology into teaching and learning with the substitution, augmentation, modification, redefinition model. I'm not going to speak about it because we have an expert that's going to speak about it. But the fact is that and I know it is a challenge at many of your schools because many of your parents do not speak English. And they don't just speak one other language. I was at a school in Fremont where there were 13 languages spoken. The teacher was trilingual, but she still had 10 kids she couldn't speak to because they were in that room and she didn't have their language. And so we have to say, we're going to create a culture that does, in fact, foster optimism, because optimism is critical to success. You got to believe if you're going to do this. You got to believe. I saw the sign in one of the neighboring rooms. You know the story, the Mets? Were ahead. They were supposed to be in last place. Everybody picked them to finish last. And after the 4th of July, they were still in first place. And they went back into the locker room, and there was dead silence. They'd come from like 8-0 behind, and they won the game. And the second baseman looked up and said, you got to believe. And that became the slogan of that entire city. And what happened? You got to believe. The Mets went on to win the World Series, of course. And so at the end of the day, part of it is making sure that the principal is the architect of a culture of success, a culture that is results-oriented, yes, but also that's ethical, that says to each child, we're going to do this We're going to do this together. The first message of leadership is really, none of us is as smart as all of us. There is an American myth that the triumphant individual is the secret to success. We tend to confuse leadership with heroism. But real leadership is not an individual phenomenon. Real leadership and sustainable change is about growing cooperation and collaboration. Bennis and Biederman have a wonderful book called Organizing Genius, and this is what they say, quote, "We have to recognize a new paradigm, not great leaders alone, but great leaders who exist in a fertile relationship with a great group. In these creative alliances, the leader and the team are able to achieve something together that neither could achieve alone. The leader finds greatness in the group, and he or she helps the members to find themselves." That's leadership. So while greatness starts with great people, in a sense, great groups and great leaders create each other. The command and control style really doesn't work. Yes, the leaders of successful organizations must act decisively, but never arbitrarily. That is why it is important to create an atmosphere where others on your team are empowered. They can and must influence the change that is needed. While we need a strong leader, he or she is more of a steward than a straw boss, keeping the others focused, minimizing distractions, and keeping optimism alive, even in the face of defeats or stumbles or setbacks. And then you've heard several setbacks here, but you kept at it. You kept getting the Chromebooks. You kept getting them into the hands of your students. This is what Bennis and Biederman have to say, quote, "The leaders of great group love talent and know where to find it. Great groups are headed by people confident enough to recruit people better than themselves. They revel in the talent of others. But they also must be certain that these talented people can work together," end quote. This means that while greatness starts with great people, it is in a sense great groups and great leaders that create one another. Your team, you as a principal, are as great as your team is, as you know, in the game. You've all seen the great quarterback that lost all of his games, or most of his games, because the team didn't work together. And so, in fact, the command and control style doesn't work in schools. Yes, some organizations have acted decisively, but never arbitrarily, and that's the thing to remember. Leaders who lead for sustainability must be believers that they are doing something vital, even holy. Because you are, really. You must be prepared to recruit people for crusades, not just jobs. Because some of our most challenged and challenging students are among the most gifted. That is why sustainable change requires optimism. You can build safety nets and scaffolding that will help not just the poorest kids in our community, but those children who are functioning in less than optimal family circumstances. And I've probably said this every time I've spoken here, but I will say to you, if you are not from a dysfunctional family, I'll bet you married someone from a dysfunctional family, or your best friend was from a dysfunctional family. Me, I'm a triple dipper. And it was those teachers who helped me to make it in this world, who helped me to be who I am today when things were not going so well. So we can build safety nets and scaffolding that will help not just the poorest children in our community, but the children who have dysfunctional families, who may be very middle class, but in fact have craziness happening. Leadership in a culture of change is not something that is innately understood by all educators. We must have a curriculum that supports the education of educators to lead the sea change that is going to be required in the future. Yes, we need to understand management, but even more important, we have to understand leadership. The other quandary is, as I mentioned before, we're entering a period where a new generation of leaders is required. A lot of principals are retiring, but too few want the job in the future. We've got to make sure that they feel empowered. And we must acknowledge that schools overall are underfunded in California and make more resources available. It's ridiculous that we have such large class sizes. You know, I'm in a blue-collar household in blue-collar community at the time in the 50s, and I went from a classroom, admittedly, in San Francisco of 44. My parents bought the littler house that cost more. They got less square footage and for more money because the school district was better. I was the 20th kid at Britton Acres Elementary School in San Carlos, California. So class size does matter, and we have to do a lot more to support what you're doing. And I will tell you that the networking offered by School to Home is important for principals, because in too many districts, they don't have that scaffolding. So I'm a believer that budgets are statements of values. If you looked at the budget of California, you'd think prisons were more important than schools. That is unacceptable to me, and I hope it is to you. But we all have to get busy here. We got work to do. And we can do this. And it's if the people coming out of a depression and war could do it, then we can do it. I like to remind people that John Kennedy loved to tell the story of an old French admiral who had retired, and he went home to his chateau, and he got the gardener to come with him, and he told him he wanted to plant these perennials and these annuals and certain shrubs, and then he started in on the trees he wanted him to add. And the gardener stopped him and said, "Sir, I really and truly have not said anything. I'm not objecting to anything except that last tree that you mentioned. It's very slow growing. It will give you no shade in your lifetime in all probability." And the old French admiral thought for a minute and said, "In that case, plant it this afternoon." And when I was sworn in at Britton Acres Elementary School as state superintendent, you know, most people go to the state library or the state capitol or the Secretary of State's building. I went to Britton Acres Elementary School in San Carlos, California to be sworn in. And I told the story about this beautiful stand of redwoods at the back of the upper playground that had been just spindly little redwoods when I was a kid, and now there's this magnificent grove. And I said, you know, I'm sure that the principal had that vision. Well, it turns out the principal, Ralph Howitt, was sitting in the audience. He had seen I was going to be sworn in at Britton Acres. He was a retired man in his 70s, and he came down, and he sat in the audience, and afterward he came up and introduced himself. And he said, "You know, Delane, they didn't make fun of me for the stand of redwoods, probably because it was the back of the upper playground, and most of them didn't notice it. They made fun of me for that spindly little oak tree I planted in the front lawn. If you ever drive by Britton Acres, go look at that oak tree. It's magnificent." And I will just tell you that I think when we think about who we are and where we're going, the time has come for us to understand, yes, real substantive reform takes time. We need the time to plan. We need the time to train. We need the time to implement. We need time to evaluate and correct, and the time to make certain that the laws are upheld, yes, but we need to get going right away. At the same time, we must commit ourselves to preparing every child in America to be a participant in the global economy as well as the American dream. The defense of America has more to do with the education of our children than building an anti-missile system, or putting a person on Mars, or building a wall between America and Mexico, or banning people from certain countries from entering our country. The defense of this country is now and always has been about having a well-educated population that dreams of a better life for themselves and perhaps most of all for their children. Today in America, most low-wage workers never move into the middle class. According to a study by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the economies of France, Italy, Britain, Germany, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden provide more mobility for low-wage workers than the United States. What do they have in common? They have great educational systems. Some of the angriest protests of the president's ill-considered immigration limitations are actually corporations in the Silicon Valley who rely on the immigration of highly skilled workers. If you actually wanted to limit immigration ethically, then let the magic of the marketplace work for American children. And tomorrow, instead of relying on imported workers, we should have American kids that we've educated and trained and given technology and the opportunity to think and work together and learn. We should allow those kids to take the high-tech jobs of the future. If America in general, and California in particular, recommitted itself to excellence in education, we might trim immigration in our nation the old-fashioned way by preparing American workers to take these jobs, to be America's workforce in the years to come. But beyond strengthening our economy and our family structure, education pays so many other benefits. In the final analysis, our best hope for social competence as well as for economic success and the prevalence of democratic values is to improve the education of our children. That's all of our children. My thanks to all of you for taking the time to be here, to improve your leadership skills, to take the opportunity to share and educate others and to be educated by them, as well as for believing that school to home and the various digital divide accommodations that we're making to make sure every kid is in contact, the achievement gap that you're closing, all of these things are important. I always use the Neil Postman quote, "Children are a living message we send to a time we will never see." I thank Anu for her lovely introduction, but I never forget that. And for those of you who've lived in a time that your parents did not live to see, you come to a special understanding that you were sent here by them to do important work, and that you must carry their message into the future. And so what is our message to the future? Well, I have hope as I look into the eyes of the people in this room that it's a good one. In fact, I have something more than hope. I have optimism. In his wonderful book, Martin Seligman's Learned Optimism, he writes, "We used to think that success in this world was a combination of talent and hard work. But it turns out there are talented, hardworking people who don't succeed. What are they lacking? They're lacking optimism." I've seen optimism. I met a little girl at a school in San Diego who looked me in the eye and told me when she grew up she was going to be a marine biologist. She was a skinny little girl who was living in the car, because it was a school for homeless children. She was living in the car with her family. But there were other children in that room who were also homeless, who were going to be doctors, lawyers. And if we have optimism about it, and you do what you're doing, you're going to see a bunch of your students come back to you in years to come and say, "Today I'm a doctor. Today I'm a lawyer. Today I'm a teacher because of you." I will just tell you that we need to have this optimism, and if you start getting sketchy about the optimism, then get yourself out to a school, because the kids have it. They believe in us, and they believe in their future. We just have to make sure that we give them hope and optimism about our ability to do this. So as the poet said, "Let us now be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait." I know you are laboring. I know sometimes you have to wait, but what you are doing is life-changing. I thank you for being on this mission. Glad to be with you. Glad to be together.
Oh, good. It didn't make any noise. I was worried it was going to make noise. Well, thanks, you guys, for having me. Hopefully you can hear me over the chewing of the food. It looks delicious. I'm sure I'm going to have some. Obviously, I'm not the superintendent, but I did want to let you know I spoke with his office, and he does regret not being able to be here. I was telling Micah, and actually I was telling Bruce and Micah earlier, it's interesting being a part of the state government and being part of a term. You know, in 2 years, his term is up. He can't run again. And this phase in the term, suddenly things have gotten really, really busy in Sacramento. And he's got a lot of people asking for his attention. And so he did want to send his regrets for not being able to be here. I know he's been here in the past. He was here last year. He did want to send his greetings and let you guys know he appreciates all your hard work and everything you do, because this is one of the highlight programs that he talks about often, and we hear about it a lot. I want to reinforce and reiterate what people have said earlier about leaders, and not only you guys who are principals. You know, I heard a lot of principals, and it was really cool to hear you guys talk through both before and after. It's interesting, about a year and a half, a little over a year ago, there was a study that was presented to the Board of Education up in Sacramento that talked about the fact that, and it was with reference to the Common Core standards, but it applies everywhere. There were district office and county office people that were very well trained and given information about the Common Core. A lot of teachers got a lot of training and information about the Common Core. But the group of people who kind of were left out was many of you, the site admin. And it's like teachers were saying one thing, districts saying, and principals were going, what, huh? And so it's really important, and I'm so glad that you guys are here being able to support what your teachers are doing. And same thing with the teachers. You guys, you're the ones that interface with the kids all the time. And you go to a conference and find out something like, hey, I want to do this with Chromebooks. And your principal's like, what's a Chromebook? You guys had that conversation? Or I got this new app and, we want to do Google Classroom or something. I was at Q. You guys are leaders too. And so it kind of takes from bottom up and I'm really, it's incredible to see all you site leaders are here. And I get it, this is a sacrifice, especially you middle school principals. There's how many kids doing what different things right now as we speak? We're eating sandwiches, and what are they doing? I get it. That's totally true. But thank you for your effort and being a part of that. I wasn't planning on doing this, but since I'm here and I saw so many San Bernardino people here, I had to add this slide in. Who was at the Curtis, or how many of you guys are Curtis staff? 1, 2, is that just Curtis back there? How many people visited Curtis? See most of the room? Just a total side personal note. Curtis is here. That new school is just west of it. And right behind what used to be a Kmart is that other school that was built in like 91. You guys know what school I'm talking about in San Bernardino? Emil Roberts, which was formerly 9th Street. That was my very, very, very first teaching gig. And just to let you know, I remember opening that school and I was brand new. I drove down there. I get there, I'm a brand new teacher, and I'm like, wow, this is so cool. I had spent the summer before, my last summer of college, I had all of these. I was training people on accounting, and they were accounting software. And afterwards, they're like, you're a new teacher, you want some computers? I'm like, sure. So they gave me 18 of those. And I remember I strung cords all across that portable, had kids doing this, using model TRS-80 Model 100s. It was really, really cool. And so when I was hearing about Curtis, hearing about San Bernardino, I'm like, oh, all these memories are coming back. And there's probably more memories, definitely more memories I want to talk about. But if there is one I'll share with some of you if they want on the side sometimes later with a student who contacted me. It's kind of a random side note. It's interesting, but this totally relates. I mean, we've been at this for a long time. The reason I bring this up, we've been at this for a long time. And you guys are doing what you're doing now, and it's so cool. So kind of cool to come home, even though it's been quite a while. My name is Jeff, and I am in the data management division. You're kind of like, what is that doing? How is that an ed tech thing? At the department, we have our superintendent, we have deputies and branches, and then we have divisions. In our division, we kind of have everything. We have the categorical complaints office, which is the office where if you forgot and charged a kid the $2 for a field trip and the mom and dad gets upset, you guys have that happen where a teacher does that? They call them, and they're right next door to us. We have the FPM office, which is the monitoring office. That's kind of not the most favorite office in the building, but it's what you do with the federal funds. We have the CalPADS office. We have the CBEDS office, and we have data reporting office, and then you have Jeff and the division office. And I have an analyst, Allie, who works with me, and our secretary. And so we kind of get all things as assigned. And one of the main things why EdTech comes along, aside from my background, is we handle the K-12 K-12 high-speed network connection grant. And so we do have a lot of things that are the backside of it, making sure those Chromebooks actually connect to something at your school and get online and can run. I did want to put a little picture up in the top right, because if you find me online, you probably won't find the picture of me, but you'll find the other one. And most people, when they meet me after they've known me online, they're like, wow, Jeff, you really look like that little black and white picture. So anyways, this is an interactive session, just so you know. Got a little icebreaker for you. Take a look at this. I'm going to give you 1 minute to try to solve it. And as long as I don't click it ahead of time, it should show up. Outside the box. See if you can solve this for me. How many people got a solution? Some people do. Anybody Googled the solution yet? No one Googled it? I Googled it to make sure I had the right solution. Sorry. Come on. And my tech isn't working. I think it's because it's waiting. No, it's okay. It's waiting for the time to go across. And I started the time over again. It'll come up in a minute. There are two solutions, by the way, to this. Yeah. If you figured out the first one, see if you can figure out the next one. This is something new I've learned. If you set a timer on it, it doesn't let you go on to the next until the time is really up. Come on. Oh, come on. Point being, working outside the box. Hopefully you guys can get to that. When they asked me to speak, they asked me to talk to you guys about what are the ways that we're using or the state is using to help evaluate the project. And so I do want to take some time and go over so you know kind of the rules of the game. You know, we just watched the Super Bowl last Sunday and it's like, well, what are the rules of the game? We want to go over and talk about it and really understand this. Now, I'm going to be talking some about the achievement gap, number one, but I do want to reference back to number two, the second goal of the Connect Home. Back to my first year of teaching there in San Bernardino, brand new teacher, I remember somebody came up to me at one point and said, "Hey, Jeff, you're not the most important person in every one of your students' life." And I'm like, what? I'm a brand new teacher. I'm here to save the world. What? Are you kidding me? And they said, no, Jeff, do the math. We have our kids for just over 6 hours a day. There's 24 hours in a day. They're somewhere else for 16 and a half, 17 and a half hours of a day. And I was like, oh, you're right. I can do the math. I am important, I realize that, but empowering and connecting kids at home and empowering those other influencers on the kid's life was key. And ever since that person told me that very first day when I was teaching there in San Bernardino, or very first year, I realized, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So this project that you guys have where you're connecting kids at home reinforces goal number two, which is really, really important. With the state has accountability goals, and I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on them. You can go over these, and you can see this PowerPoint if you want later on and get it. But when we put together stuff like this, and the state puts out goals like this, the board, I like, okay, we did this, we said this, let's follow through on it. And when the feds try to come in and put some stuff on us, we're like, no, this is our goal. This is what we're doing. Let's stay with this. Let's follow this. We want to focus on teaching and learning. We want to build individual capacity and institutional capacity. We want to phase in changes thoughtfully, and we'll respond to what the feds say with what works for California in a logical manner once it's established. Let's not rush things. So when the California put out the California Blueprint for California Schools for Great Schools, and it says we want educators we believe that educators want to excel, we're going to say, yeah, I believe that. Anybody in here not believe that? You know, if they say it, then we'll put it in writing. Building on trust. We want to know that we are trusted. That's one thing that's huge for me. I want to know that I'm trusted. And then also, let's give ourselves the resources so we can improve and do what we need to do that's make it best for the kids. That said, we're now to the point where we're going, okay, how are we going to measure academic achievement? And oftentimes we look at this. This screen look familiar to anybody? What is this one? CASP results, right? Test results. And in the CASP, we test where the assessment, the SBAC is assessing kids grades 3 to 8 and then 11. All of you who teach middle school and are in middle schools, it's important. I mean, look, 3 out of the 7 grades that are tested in middle school. So for San Bernardino Unified, our middle school kids are a big impact on the on the overall list of our overall performance of the whole district. Also, sometimes when we think about data, we think about it in numbers. But what I would like you guys to consider, and what we're trying to shift in our office, and we have this more often than not, is we're like, let's get past the numbers, past the results, and realize it's the kids. Honestly, that's the bottom line. It's the kids. These middle school kids, elementary school kids, and they're using devices. This past, I guess it was October, I was on a WASP visit, and I would like to encourage you guys, if you don't do WASP visits, do WASP visits. This isn't a WASP promotional thing. But WASPs are great chances for you to take off your hat that you do for your daily life, go somewhere else that you normally wouldn't go, and sit down and just look at education for what the purpose is you're going. And so I was visiting a school, and I sat down with some middle school kids. I said, we were talking about how the school culture is, and I said, hey, so how's testing been? And these were 7th and 8th graders. I said, how's it been? And one girl said, these are kids who've done the test twice now. And we were talking, how's the results? I'm like, how's it been? And they're like, it's hard. I said, oh, really? They're like, yeah, they put us all in one room, all 100 of us by grade, with computers. We all faced forward, and we couldn't leave and move until everybody was done. My neck hurt so bad. And I'm like, if we all sat in a room facing the same way and couldn't leave until we were all done, I think my neck would be hurting bad too. And I'm like, Another little kid says, there was just so much clicking. I couldn't handle all the clicking. And I'm like, good point. My point in bringing this up is when it comes to these testing, the thing we need to talk about and think about is this is who it is. Not the results, this is it. And if the kids can't get by the environment, we can't get to what they know. So it's like the scores don't matter if they can't. I mean, the one kid, he's like, I couldn't even tell you what I knew because the clicking was just too hard. Can I just go back to the pencil paper version? I'm like, we're going where we're going. So let's figure out how to get you more experiences using clicking, and so we don't have to worry about it. But sitting down and having conversations, I said, my 15-minute conversation about this in the context of an overall hour-long interview with a group of students, a random group of students, was way more impactful to our testing coordinators than anything they had gotten otherwise. And so do you take the time to stop and talk to the kids, go, okay, how's it been? What's it like? Talk to parents, how's it been? What's it like? How can we change it? I mean, maybe they could stretch it out and change how they were testing the kids in a different format. Maybe they could do like what we did in college. When you're done, you get to leave, Yeah, there'll be some crazy kids that'll just, get through and leave. But with online testing, that's not going to be as easy as it was for us in college. Was I the only one that used to test fast and leave? Anybody else? I was always trying to be out of the door. Another picture of kids, just to reinforce that it's about them. The state board is making decisions based on these results, though, and I wanted to make sure you guys understood and saw that. They've decided on this back in January. They said these are going to be our indicators for California, for the state, and for the federal government, and they're going to then formally adopt them in July at the state meeting, so that goes into the ESSA application. As you know, there's different priorities in the LCAP. There's 10 of them, and so there's assessment that goes along with each one. And what I wanted to bring here forward is this is what they've settled on and what they voted on and settled on. If you're not aware of these, you should be. For priority 4, which is the academic attainment, you have both the academic indicator from the SBAC or the CASP, and then you also have the English learner subgroup, how they did on it. They settled on it for, which is number pupil engagement. They settled on absenteeism and grad rate, because that was the one thing a lot of times they were talking about. Where do you use a grad rate? Well, middle school and elementary school kids don't graduate everybody. So they've decided and settled on absenteeism, suspension rates for the priority for school climate, along with the climate survey, and then college/career indicator. Couple notes. Middle schools and elementary schools don't offer high school courses, right? So that goal for priority 7 and 8 may or may not be applicable. And I actually asked the LCAP office, I said, if somebody does an LCAP and they're a K5 or K8 and they put NA in there, what are you going to do? They're like, well, you're right, it's a high school thing. So it's not something that applies. Yes, we want to prepare kids for beyond, but you're not offering something that's going to connect them to the college. Suspension indicator, again, this was an interesting story I ran across when I was on a visit. I was talking to a school, or actually I was visiting a school, talking to the principal, and I walked in and I saw the 3 or 4 kids sitting in the office with the yellow pads writing statements. Anybody, you guys familiar with that? If you go in the office, you see kids sitting at different desks writing statements, everybody knows what happened, right? Something went down. And so I don't know what went down, but something went down. So I went and I was talking to the principal. I said, so what's the story? He's like, yeah, those are my 3 guys. They were at a conference. I don't remember what the incident was. I said, oh, okay. He says, yeah, but let me tell you about what we do here and it relates to suspensions. I said, oh, okay. He says, our policy here, we instituted it 2 or 3 years ago when I first got here, a year after I got here, is when a kid does something that's a suspendable offense, they have to deal with it. But when it comes down to what they choose as an outcome, they can choose the documented, 3-day, 5-day suspension, whatever, or they have 2 weeks where mom and dad can come and serve that suspension with them, where mom or dad or guardian can go to class with them for 2 or 3 days, however many days long it is. And if mom or dad choose to come to class with them for 2 or 3 days, however long it is, 3 or 5 days, then it doesn't go on their permanent record. So you have kids who don't want something on their permanent record. Mom and dad take time off work, come sit with you in class. He said, it's interesting. There's been some side benefits that are positive. It's amazing how teaching and learning has changed because I got all these adults wandering around campus, going to classes with their kids. Teachers are teaching a little differently. I'm like, that's true. It's like, okay, when the adults are in the room. He said, number 2, obviously suspensions have gone down because there's less on the books. But he said, really, the most interesting thing is the suspendable offenses have gone down because kids know, oh, okay, this is an option. I don't want to do it, so maybe I'll stop. He said, overall, they went down, but suspendable offenses went down. I was like, wow, that's pretty interesting. Now, this was 2 years ago, so I haven't gone back to see how they've been in the last, what's happened since I was visiting at school. But I'd be curious and would guess that they probably they're addressing, giving kids a way to recover for the mistakes they make, which is really cool. And that's important for kids to be able to have. So these indicators that as have been adopted are something that you should be aware of and want to make sure you guys know. One thing that was a big topic lately is they're trying to take this now and put this in a list format. And I say it that way because everybody wants to make sure they don't say ranked or honestly I don't even know what the appropriate term is. But somehow schools for the federal government are going to have to be listed and identified as how they've done, how they're doing. And so they came across the last board meeting, they came up with this matrix that shows your status and your change year to year on each of those indicators I just went over. And so you'll notice that there's different colors too that go along with it. And what's happening is a green school is doing well. Blue is the best, yellow, orange, and then red, of course, is the bottom if you rank them in order. You can see that here's a couple examples. Graduation rates for the state, this was what they identified. These are the percentages over on the left, and it's awful small on my screen. 67 is the bottom. 85, I couldn't remember these numbers, I'm sorry, I didn't memorize them. But you can see where the grad rates are, and again, this is a high school number because this would be high schools. And then whether they change year to year or over a trend, you'll get a identifier for your school as how it's doing with that on that particular one. Overall across the whole state, I don't want to go too far into this, across the whole state, districts, the majority of districts are in the yellow range, and the majority of schools are in the blue range. So and I don't know if there's really because the indicators that were the K-8s are factored into it as opposed to the high schools. I'm not really sure. I was looking at these numbers going, okay, I want to see what's underneath that to really understand what's behind it. But this is just an example of how they're taking that number and listing it and ranking it for grad rate. Here's another one for EL, the cut scores for our English learner, how this English learner students would be ranked, and these they settled on this, and then here's our performances of the whole state as of last year. And That one there? Yeah, sorry. So again, you have most of the districts in orange or yellow, if you really did, although there are some districts in green, so it's kind of spread across the middle. But again, you have the schools are kind of in the same. This one mirrored more than the graduation. That's why I wanted to share this one with you. But the bottom line is, all these decisions are being made to help us identify and see how students are doing academically. The colors are listed and are going to be put into what's called a district dashboard. From what I understand, I've been told the district dashboard should have been shared with districts recently or soon, like last week Micah says. They are embargoed for about a month, from what I understand, before you can share them out with the stakeholders. But you'll get a dashboard that says for each of them, the district and school will be able to see what level they're at for each of these in a graphical form. And they did it on purpose with these pie-shaped things so that you could see it if it was black and white too. So that way we could see and ranked. And then what will happen is, as I said, going to try to, for the sake of being able to help provide support, identify which of the bottom 5% or lowest 5% of schools are going to get support, assuming that most of them are in yellow and red for sure. That's a potential. But then if there's more, what would be the other districts that would be identified as support? So it's one of those things that's being grappled with actually even as you speak, especially when it comes to ESSA. There's a series of webinars and trainings that are going out and meetings coming out. If you can get another day to get out of your classroom and away from your school to go to that training, I would encourage you to do that, because we really need to have our voice heard from the school perspective. It's good to have the school's voice and go, hey, wait a second, that doesn't make sense, or that's a good idea. For the school's sake. Have some reference materials, and again, if you want this access to this, I'll share this with you so you can read and find out some more information. Been talking at you pretty fast. I want to give you guys a chance, give you 3 minutes to help. We'll see if I can make my computer do the same thing again. Come up with a tweet or some short message that will explain, or to give me one thing, and I'll give you a bonus if you actually tweet it out with the hashtag, that can explain this accountability as it relates to your school or district. So what's one thing? Talk amongst yourself, come up with one message, and if you can tweet it out with that hashtag, you get more points. And it looks like I've already used up 1 minute of the 3 minutes, so you only have 2 minutes left. All right. Everybody come up with your short message. Uh-oh. Hashtag S2H Lead Acad. Hashtag S2H Lead Acad. For all the Twitter people out there. Thanks for playing along with the Twitter challenge. So I was asked to talk about some trends and some things that are going on that we hear about, and things where we see we're going in more in general than just about the academic indicators. One of the things is, for those of you who've seen this picture before, you know how the world is changing. For those of you who haven't, who has not seen this picture before? Who has seen the picture before? What's the picture of? Someone who's seen it before. Technology change. It's not a wedding. It's changing. What's the picture on the top of? Which pope? Pope Benedict. And what's the one on the bottom? Pope Francis. So Pope Benedict in 2005, which to me seems like just yesterday, honestly. Look, you got one guy in the bottom right-hand corner who's got a Gibbs phone, taking pictures with a flip phone. Pope Francis, you have everybody taking pictures, including the iPad picture taker people. The power of the devices is incredible. And things are changing so quickly. Social networking too. Yeah, social networking and the devices. Exactly. This one is another favorite of mine. I loved Radio Shack. You guys saw my Radio Shack picture before. 1991, back when I started there at 9th Street Elementary, I could buy all that stuff for $3,000 about. I added it all up one day. It's all free on this after I buy this device, and it's an app. So the power of what we have, the power of what kids have, the power of what is at our fingertips now is just night and day compared to when many of us started teaching or when we were growing up. It's incredible to see, and the data that's generated because of that. You know, I mentioned what's going on in your schools right now. It may be being shared on social media or online even before you even know it. How many of you are thankful that there was no social media sharing what we did when we were in middle school? Anybody? I know there's a story I would be explaining to many people if it was on video, but unless you find Tommy or Mike or Wayne, you'll never know what I did. So, and I'm not going to tell. Unless they tell, we won't. But technology is changing. You guys, that's why you're here. You guys know that and you can see that. In order to try to catch up with it and all the data that's being generated, there's all sorts of legislation. In 2015 alone, you see these were all states that introduced or passed state legislation about trying to protect student data and our data and devices and just trying to stay ahead of it. It's a real swirling topic. We have one consultant only who's constantly chasing and staying ahead of these issues. 2016, you see, we're again on the books as California already, we passed legislation, and this was as of 1st of October even. We had new legislation. The interesting thing, though, I want to land on this slide for a minute. If you look at this slide, though, you compare the two sides. Legislation 3 years ago compared to now about prohibiting what we do, you notice it hasn't really changed much. But you notice what legislation is starting to shift from is in governance. Because people have realized that you can have the best system in the world, but if the people aren't on board, it's like having a bank and leaving the vault wide open for people to walk in. If you don't protect it and if you don't have it, it's got to focus on the people. And that's what data governance is, focusing on the people. That's what you guys are so important, helping educate the parents and educate the kids and educating ourselves on knowing what's going forward and what's happening. Here's the thing that's crazy. The attacks are getting even more specific. I've actually started now where I don't click on something, I don't click on anything on an email, even if it looks like if it's from somebody who I know, because they're specifically targeted attacks. I missed an invitation to attend a meeting by a group, kind of like this once. They're like, we invited you. I'm like, I didn't see it. Like, yeah, we did. It's your thing. I'm like, well, I saw an email from somebody, but it looked like spam, honestly, and I'm not about to click on a link and find out more information. If you want me to come, send me a regular email, tell me I'm sending you an invite email, and then I'll click on it. Because you look at it, you see, phishing, ransomware. Schools are being affected by ransomware. It's interesting with ransomware. Most of the time you pay for ransomware, you pay for it in Bitcoin. And I was talking to somebody about that. I'm like, where's the Bitcoin ATM? I mean, does anybody know? Has anybody actually had to pay for something in Bitcoin? Are you guys more cool than me? I'm like, how do you do Bitcoin? I don't know. But there's school districts and community colleges. LA Community College over Christmas break had to pay like 40 grand, I think it was, to get ransomware dealt with in Bitcoin. I'm like, oh, okay, so Bitcoin, you go on a website and put in your credit card number and pay. Does that sound shady or what? I'm not interested in doing that. That would be scaring me. But that's something that's affecting our networks and our education. So all of our systems, including healthcare, spearfishing and whaling are interesting because that's the targeted ones, or the, this one was interesting. We did kind of a human version of this where the IT department sent an email that it looked like it came from the superintendent's office they made a fake email that changed it just slightly, his email just slightly, and invited some staff to come to the boardroom for a special meeting, and they weren't supposed to tell their manager. And you'd be amazed. There were people that showed up. When they got there, like, sorry, you fell victim to this whaling attack. The superintendent will email you, and if he did, he wouldn't have invited you to come to a meeting without telling your manager. Think of what that could have happened if this was real. So whaling, it's interesting, but things are becoming more sophisticated and more challenging for us to stay ahead of. So, and in 30 seconds, what is a 30-second pitch or 30 seconds that you could talk about and explain the trends as they apply to your school and your district? 30 seconds. 30-second pitch, you have 3 minutes. If it works right this time, we'll see. All right, everybody have your elevator pitch? You guys got it? You can go back and explain. Try to explain to your kids, don't click on those links. We don't want to lose we don't want to have us fall victim to ransomware, right? We don't want to lose our information. I want to land the plane on this with this couple thoughts here, and then open it up for questions. I asked you to start thinking outside the box, and a lot of times we think about some of these things I was sharing with accountability and metrics and this stuff as boxes that kind of contain us. You know, we have to put things in a box and handle it. The thing is, though, that's interesting, when you ask kids what to do with a box, or you get kids a box, kids do fun things with boxes, right? They build forts, they build things. I mean, I was looking for pictures. There's crazy things people do with boxes. And so I want to stop and think about this for a little bit, and think about this for just a second here. Over Christmas, one of our favorite things to do is watch movies. We took our kids to see the Christmas Story, or the It's a Wonderful Life at the Crest Theater. We also watched Elf. Anybody else watch Elf? And my dad loves to watch A Christmas Story. You guys know Christmas Story. The famous line for Christmas Story is, "You'll shoot your eye out," right? And in the movie, if you think about it, there's a portion of time where Ralphie's in school and the teacher says, "Okay, it's time to write a theme." And Ralphie goes online and he sits down and writes a theme. You know, this Red Ryder BB gun would be the best, you know, here's it. He's just sure that it's going to get him an A+. Remember, he's like, A+, you know, and she's loving it. You know, he gets back the answer, was it an F? C-, and the note, "You'll shoot your eye out," right? But the thing that's interesting, though, is it got to me thinking, when he wrote the paper, when he wrote that assignment, he sat down with his lined paper and he wrote it with a pencil and turned it in, right? When I was in school, and when many of you guys were in school, we sat down, we wrote a paper, we wrote it with pencil and pen. I typed it on a typewriter. I took typing, remember that skill on a typewriter? My daughter actually found a typewriter the other day. She's like, "Dad, this is so cool, it looks vintage." I'm like, I actually used it in 9th grade. But, you know, we turned it in. Then along comes times where we had word processors and we turn it in. Now we have Google Classroom and we turn it in. But we're still just writing papers and turning them in. We're writing themes. And I got into thinking about it going, why do we do papers? You know, there's a reason to write papers. I get it. It should be. But isn't the whole point of writing papers and stuff is we want to have kids demonstrate that they understand or demonstrate they learn something, right? And so is there a way that maybe with technology, if we think about what's on our devices, they got cameras, and both still and video cameras. We have recorders that we can record voice. We have apps that let kids create and be creative with. There's Web 2.0 tools where kids can get online and work together on things. If the goal is to demonstrate learning, is there a way that maybe we can start to think about, okay, is there a different way we can get kids to demonstrate learning? Because I get it. When there was, you know, when you were a teacher and you had 150 students, you couldn't sit down and listen to 150 kids tell you what they knew. Or have them make a video because they didn't have video cameras. But now if they're trying to demonstrate what they're learning, maybe we can rethink about what kids are actually asking us to, what we're asking kids to do. Other ways possibly. And the thing that to understand though is, you know, is it training that we need to do? Well, you guys are here doing training. Is it connection? School to Home's offering connection. Is it technology? They have the connection. I think the pieces are there that maybe we can take and trade. Because here's the thing that I want to close with on this. Even Steph Curry, I'm from Northern California, sorry. You know, everybody else up there? Yeah? You know? Incredible ball handler. You put one basketball in this hand, one basketball in this hand, you give him a third basketball. Even Steph Curry, unless he can do something magical, can't hold a third basketball, right? You can juggle, but what's the risk of juggling? Dropping it. I can only hold two basketballs. Oh, he can only hold two basketballs. So at some point, we have to think about going, okay, if we're going to do something different, I got to put that one down and pick something else up. And is that okay? I would say maybe it is, but we don't want to try to add a third thing on because we don't want to drop stuff on it, because we got to start thinking about it going, okay, that box, the outside the box idea, maybe if we start to think about letting kids be creative, going, okay, this is what you're doing. Project-based learning does this great. There's other things. Allowing kids to go, okay, here's the box, figure out, just tell me what you know. Show me what you know. Show me what you learned. And then after that happens, then we can figure out how to build that into the assessment systems and build that into the accountability systems. Because honestly, those are just the way they are because we've been doing it that way for how many years, right? If something new comes along, we'll figure out a way to assess it. And we'll figure out a way to do it. And you guys will be the ones leading that effort, I believe, because it has to come from the teachers and the principals in the classrooms.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Let me tell you a little bit what I would like to do this afternoon. When we were talking about my presentation, there was a question of, okay, so what topics would be particularly interesting to the audience? And what we came up with was a list of 3 topics, and I'll be touching on each of those as we're going to see progressively, because they follow a sort of telescoping sequence that speaks to how we use technology across a range of scenarios, and then ultimately try to get the maximum mileage, the maximum improvement in student outcomes from it. So let's start right there. And if I can go to first slide. All right, so the question then, the first topic or the first aspect is, what do we want to see happen at the most micro scale? In other words, what's happening in the individual classroom? What happens in terms of how do we use the technology and SAMR to help guide the use of that technology to improve student outcomes? And that's what I'm going to talk about first. So if we can go next slide. Okay, so here's SAMR. I know most of you are familiar already with SAMR, so I'm not going to redo a basic introduction to the model. But there's a couple of things I find that even people who've been using SAMR for a while, it's worthwhile reminding. First, you can always think of SAMR as the intersection of 2 strands. One strand that has to do, yes, with technology. So I have a new technology that does some things that the old technology couldn't do. I have a new technology that does some things better than the old technology could. I have some things that I can do with the new technology that are very different than what the old technology could accomplish. So I'm always looking at a scenario where an older technology existed and a new technology comes into play. And it's important to look at that as, yes, it's an expansion of a world of possibilities and so on, but by itself, it can't account for what actually happens in the classroom. To do that, you have to think of the second strand. And the second strand is, how do teachers respond to changes? And yes, one change might be a technological change, but it could also be a change in curricular approaches, a change in pedagogical approaches, etc. So what happens in a teacher's practice? Does it remain the same? Does a teacher seek out new possibilities? Do they seek out modifications? Do they think about, why was I doing that in the first place? How do I change that? What could I now accomplish, etc.? And this applies to any change. So when you have the intersection of those 2 strands, the strand of the technology and the strand of what happens in a teacher's practice, is where you get the SAMR model. And that's important to keep in mind. Remember, technology or a particular use of technology by itself does nothing guaranteed in terms of outcomes. Just looking at how a teacher's practice changes also doesn't tell you very much because, well, what are the tools that enable that teacher to make certain ideas, certain results of those planned changes feasible? It's the intersection of both that gives you the SAMR model. So that's the first thing, a different way of thinking about SAMR. And the second aspect I always like to point out is SAMR is not a model for judgment. In other words, as you go from substitution to augmentation to modification to redefinition, yes, you get greater impact upon student outcomes. Yes, you can do things that you couldn't do before. Yes, there are many possibilities open up that weren't open before, but that doesn't mean that working at the lower levels of SAMR is a bad thing in and of itself. In other words, doing something at the substitution level is not necessarily bad. It may be perfectly appropriate. Doing something at augmentation is not by itself necessarily better than doing more things at substitution. You have to think about how you build up on things. The reason you'd like to get to a substantive percentage of teaching practice being at the highest levels, modification and redefinition, is because those are the levels that introduce the greatest impact, have the greatest possibility to change, improve student outcomes, but in and of themselves, there's nothing better or worse. In other words, what you want to look at is the whole set, the whole ensemble of practice. So that's also important. Again, it's not a question of saying to somebody, oh, you're doing that at substitution, you're a bad person, or you're doing a bad thing. That's not true at all. Maybe perfectly appropriate, and that's fine. Maybe all they need to do with that, and that's fine. The question is, how do you build upon that? How do you build upon that? Because when you're looking at saying what's happening in my classrooms, in my school, etc., when you're saying, well, on a bigger SAMR picture, what's happening, it's not a question of an individual activity, it's a question of what percentage of the use is at a given level. And yes, there is a strong incentive to say how much of the practice is at the higher levels, because that's where the greatest changes can occur. All right, so that's a little bit of backdrop. What I'm going to do now is say, okay, so the question that I got was, how do we use SAMR and associated uses of technology most effectively to improve student outcomes? And there's many, many ways, but I want to show you one approach that has worked really, really well for me, as well as for people using similar approaches, and that is to say, well, what happens if I take SAMR and I harness it to another model that also represents things that I would like to see happen with students at progressively greater or higher levels? Now, there are several different models you can use for this. You could use Bloom's taxonomy, and for those of you who are interested, I wrote a small article about this, and it's on the Common Sense Media site. But today, if we can go to the next slide, I want to show you how to harness SAMR to web, in other words, to the depth of knowledge model. What I can say is, look, there's an infinity of things I could use the technology for, that I could choose to introduce the use of technology guided by SAMR at different levels, et cetera, et cetera. But in particular, as a teacher, I'm going to focus on saying, I'm going to make the lower levels of SAMR correspond to the lower levels of web. The upper levels of SAMR correspond to the upper levels of web. I want to emphasize that this is a marriage of convenience, not a marriage of necessity. I could be doing things at the extended thinking level, say, using substitution level tools, and vice versa. I could be doing things at the recall and reproduction using tools at the redefinition level. So all of those are possibilities. Or I could be making any sort of mix and match of levels of SAMR, levels of web. There is no necessary correspondence here. But there is a very good convenient correspondence here that helps me direct how I might focus my efforts as a teacher, how I might choose to change a unit of practice, because I say, well, look, I know web, I know what it does for me, I know how this is going to be reflected in student outcomes. I'm then going to harness my use of technology to make a one-to-one match, so that as I progress from the web perspective, from depth of knowledge, I'll also be doing this from a SAMR perspective, up the levels of the ladder. So that's the general idea. I find that these ideas work best if introduced by an example, so I'm going to show you just one such example. So if we can go to the next slide. I'm doing this with an example drawn from the topic of urban agriculture. Now, this is a bit of a personal passion of mine. It's a topic I think is hugely important. Some of you know I live in Western Massachusetts, very, very urban area, all of 6,000 people. So a bit different from Los Angeles, but whether you're looking at that type of a community or a place like Los Angeles, the idea of saying, how do you get students, children to think about, the process of producing food themselves, creating by agriculture food, the whole process of thinking about that, what's involved, what it can do for a community if it's incorporated as a practice in the community as a whole, can have a huge impact. So that's why I chose that as a topic. And I want to show you a very quick example. The example is laid out in the form of what I call a SAMR ladder, in which not only am I harnessing SAMR to web, but in addition to that, I'm going to be going progressively through the unit in the order of the successive steps. So I start at substitution at the beginning of the unit, develop into augmentation, from there to modification, from there to redefinition. Again, this is not a necessary progression. You might be starting at modification, reaffination, whatever is appropriate for that particular case. But I find it simplest sometimes if I explain the topic following this progression. And it can also be, by the way, for a teacher who's just starting out in their use of technology, a particularly straightforward or easy way to incorporate technology into their practice. So we start at substitution, and here I'm going to say, well, okay, what would I have the students do? I'd have them learn some of the basics of what's involved in an urban agriculture project, some of the aspects of plants that were going to be involved, soil, etc. And I'm going to use the computer to, for instance, acquire knowledge about this. So not just books or papers or articles about this, but also, for instance, there are small courses, right? OER courses that students can take online that they can extract knowledge from. So they're going to be using their tablet or laptop or whatever it is to acquire this knowledge. So we're straight at the recall and reproduction stage in terms of web, or level in terms of web. And what I'm doing here is straight substitution. Everything I could have done here, I could have done just with paper, okay? I could have done it with traditional resources, but in this case, the technology allows me to access these resources. In particular, some of the interesting things that might happen is some of these resources might have been created actually by other students, and that's something that's very intriguing that has become possible now to access because of social media, because of social storage on places like YouTube, to access that. So that it becomes intriguing, but again, we're still at straight substitution. There really is no change, and I would expect no change in outcomes vis-a-vis what I could do with traditional paper. All right, so if we go to the next slide, now we're going to build upon this. And what I want now the students to do is to elaborate what they have acquired from a web perspective, develop certain skills, elaborate concepts, integrate concepts. And one of the things they're going to need to do is they're going to need to say, okay, I have all this knowledge, but now I need to do something. So I'm going to ask the students to actually put together small tutorial videos explaining how to do something. So here, for instance, we have a video that's been put together by a student to explain how you check some leafy greens to make sure they have no pests, that they're not wilting, that their fertilizer levels are appropriate, etc. So they've created a small interactive step-by-step video, and this is going to allow them to share with their fellow classmates what they are developing at this level, how they are understanding these skills, etc. So they're now putting together materials that are not generic, like the ones I started out with before. They are now creating materials that are targeted for both what they need to learn to know how to do, as well as what their fellow classmates are going to need to do. This puts me straight at the augmentation level. Yes, it's something I could have done with traditional media, right? Just by having them write, make sketches and so on, but it's augmented. It's augmented because one of the things I've done now is I've created something that can be easily and readily shared, for instance, via YouTube or a local video server in this regard. It's also something that can have a feedback loop associated with it. So for instance, students can say, well, gee, this worked better for me, this didn't work better, could you explain it better, and so on. So the students can re-edit whatever they've created so it better serves that. And this is a type of feedback loop that would have been difficult to implement prior to the access to the technology. Finally, the technology allows me to integrate different media. So it's not just a piece of paper and a sketch. I can say, well, hold on. If I'm going to show somebody, for instance, how to cull greens so that a pest doesn't spread to the rest of the crop, I can explain it with 10,000 drawings on a piece of paper, but if I show you a video saying, and this is how you do it, bingo, you've got it. And the fact that I can integrate this, once again, enhances what I could do before, so it puts it straight at the augmentation level. If I were to do a one-to-one comparison in terms of how students perform at this level compared to, say, doing it with traditional media, I would expect to see a small but noticeable improvement. I'm going to actually put some numbers on this, but let's keep going. So if I go to the next slide, now I'm going to go to strategic thinking. So now I need the students going beyond just the basic concepts. I need them to take all of the concepts from this area and do some forward planning. Decide if X and Y, then Z. So for instance, let's assume that what I want the students doing as part of this project is this project is going to move from just a few experimental plantings and so on to actually developing a full crop, if you will, that's going to be sold to benefit the school or the community. So the students now need to plan, well, what am I going to plant? Why am I going to plant it? How am I going to do this? So what I've got here is an app that allows the students to do just that, lay out the crops, but they'll also get warnings about, by the way, this crop has yields in this season, this crop tends to attract this type of plague, that crop tends to not attract it. In other words, it gives them the tools. So instead of saying, well, gee, I like carrots, therefore I'm going to plant a lot of carrots, it gives them the tools to start thinking about how everything they've seen in the 2 previous levels fits together in terms of planning. And what the technology does is it gives them a certain groundwork for significantly modifying the task. Remember, right now we're at the modification level. So at the modification level, we have the heart of the task being the same as before. I would always have asked them, plan out what you're going to plant in this garden, et cetera, et cetera. But now I'm significantly modifying the task by providing them with decision support software. That's essentially what this is. That allows them to lay out the garden. It allows them to see the consequences. They can start getting things like costs when this would be planted and so on. In other words, the way in which students are thinking about how to plant this garden has been significantly modified from what could have happened otherwise, what would have come before. And again, this is tied at a web level with strategic thinking. Here I would expect to see significant improvements in student outcomes. Again, we'll come to some numbers later, but let's go to the next slide where we see, okay, end of the term or end of the unit, really, not term. What are we going to do? And now, okay, from a web perspective, we'll get into extended thinking. Now they need to be thinking not just about how to integrate within one sphere, they need to be reaching across spheres, they need to be integrating across different concept areas to come up with new strategies, new planning, new integration of knowledge, and so on. Remember that I said that this garden was designed to be such that its crops could be sold. So I'm going to ask the students now to plan out and to evolve their planning as the crops come in, as the sales go in. For, is this working? Should we scrap all of the peppers, say, from this and plant celery instead? What should be going on? And of course, I need to provide them with the visualization and analysis tools to do that. And again, one of the tricks here is now I can have the students do something I could not have reasonably asked them to do prior to the advent of the technology. Prior to the advent of technology, there was simply too much data, too hard to put together. It would not have been possible to do much more other than summative. Did our garden make more money? Yes, no, that's it. Here I can ask them, no, on the fly, as you're going along, suddenly all your carrots wilted. Well, again, traditionally it would have been, and so the carrots went, the end. Here I can say, well, okay, so quickly, what can you plant now? Remember, we have all of that support, all of that knowledge from before that will help you round out the gap that the carrots left or what have you. In other words, what the software is allowing my students to do here is to engage in a form of extended thinking where they're integrating what they know about how to cultivate crops, what grows, how to make this work better or worse, with what they know about what people want to buy, what people want to eat, how much they're willing to pay for it, and what their targets are financially, how to balance costs versus profits, etc. So it definitely meets extended thinking. It also meets redefinition in terms of being the type of project I could not have done before prior to the advent of the technology. In this particular case, it's not just a modification like I had at the previous level. This is not. Reasonably, I could not have asked for this before. So this is an example of how to rethink a unit of instruction using SAMR tied to web for a particular purpose. At each level, I said, what would I like the students to be doing? What type of thinking from the depth of knowledge perspective? And then I said, given this and given the context of the unit, how do I use the technology to best achieve those results? That's, again, just one example. But what I want to emphasize is that what this allows you to do is to have, in addition to a guide for how to use the technology and a guide that's connected to something a teacher also knows, it also allows you to get away from one of the challenges that people say to themselves, well, the technology is one more thing added to the table. If you can make it so that the other things on the table, whether it's, okay, we're going to be using a DOK approach or a Bloom-inspired approach, or we're going to use a project-based or challenge-based learning approach, if you can say, well, okay, let me take the components of that, break it apart, and tie it to SAMR and to a progression through a technology, you've successfully answered that question. In other words, you've made it easier for people to adopt the use of the technology. I say this is just one example, but I wanted to show it to you as an example of how the whole thing works. And also for those of you who might be a little bit less familiar with SAMR, see a little bit of a more in terms of what's involved in a progression through the levels. And I want to emphasize this particular approach in which you go through a unit, say it's called the SAMR ladder. I didn't come up with that term. Let me give credit where credit is due. Jim Moulton. We've been working in Maine for quite some time. We had come up with lots of the examples like this where we were progressing through a unit of instruction in this way. And Jim says, gee, they kind of look like a ladder. Shouldn't we call them maybe SAMR ladders? I said, Jim, you got it. So Jim gets full credit for it. But when you hear the term SAMR ladder, sometimes I hear it used to the model as a whole. The model as a whole does not say there's a necessary progression of any sort. It just applies to this particular type of use, which, again, can be very powerful, very useful, particularly for a beginning teacher, but is by no means prescriptive in any sense of the word. All right. I said, okay, we start out with next to no impact, that substitution on outcomes, small impact, larger impact, dramatic impact. Let's put some numbers on that. So if I can go to the next slide. Okay, this is a test for your eyesight, all the way back in the last row. Can you tell me what Roblier's score was on? Okay. You've got all of these slides available to you, and by the way, please feel free to reuse them. I always make my slides available under Creative Commons, so feel free to share with your communities, teachers, etc., as desirable or useful. What I've got here is from the work of Dr. Tamim and her team, and I have a huge debt with Dr. Tamim and her team, where they go back and they say, okay, there are all of these studies that have been made of the use of technology over the years. These studies have in turn been aggregated into meta-studies, where we take a whole set of studies and we say, well, in this particular area, was the net result positive, negative of the use of technology in education? Well, they've done a meta-study of meta-studies now, in which they've taken all of those meta-studies, analyzed them, reanalyzed all the studies that were dependent upon, and then said, this is the picture that emerges. So this encompasses over 1,000 individual studies, okay, as you can see, a couple of dozen meta-studies of those studies. And the first thing you want to look at, and again, I realize it's a little bit of an eye test here, but is the column that says mean ES. ES stands here for effect size. And effect size, for those of you who need a quick refresher, is when you measure the improvement of the average in scores for, say, some type of standard measure in your students by taking, you have a control group that didn't use the technology, you have a test group or treatment group that used the technology, and say, well, the scores improved by this amount. The effect size is that amount measured in units of the standard deviation. So if I say, for instance, that between these two groups of students, I saw a net improvement of an effect size of 0.5, that means that the average score between the two, between treatment and control, improved by half a standard deviation. All right, that's the effect size. Even if you can't read the numbers, the first thing that should strike you is all of the column that says mean ES is positive with exactly one exception. Okay? Now that exception is Koufogianakis and Wiebe, and it's a tiny, tiny little negative number. It's actually very close to 0. It's worthwhile looking at why that particular set of uses yields a negative effect size. But the thing is, the remaining 1,000 plus all yield positive numbers. So this is an important thing to take away right off the bat. For people who say, well, we haven't studied it enough, yes, we have. We really have. And the result of using technology in education in terms of student outcomes is a net positive, all right? Now, some of those numbers are bigger, some of them are smaller. How do we know which ones which way gives me the biggest numbers or the biggest impact? Say hello once again to SAMR. Let's see what this looks like, for instance, through a SAMR lens, if we can do the next slide. This is just for actually one meta study done by Tamim and her team, okay? And this is, for instance, for tablets in education. This is a very recent meta study, came out last year. And what you see here is I can say, well, okay, I can take it from where Dr. Tamim and her team left it. I can look at each of these uses and assign to it, whether it's substitution, augmentation, modification, redefinition. And you get this curve over here. You can see that the average for substitution is around 0, although there's a spread there. Then you have a small around 0.3 to 0.4 result for augmentation, around 0.75 to 0.8 for modification, and roughly double that again for redefinition. So you tend to see a net set here that's negligible, vanishing, small, roughly double that at modification, roughly double that at redefinition. So this is what SAMR is telling you. If you're doing things at the upper levels of SAMR, the odds of having a large positive impact upon student outcomes are much greater by virtue of this, okay? So roughly an effect size of around 0.4 or thereabouts for A, 0.8 or thereabouts for modifications, 1.6 or thereabouts for redefinition. There tends to be more noise at both ends of the scale, so both at substitution and redefinition, you have a broader spectrum of actual outcomes, but the averages or medians, depending on how you're doing this either way, come out to those numbers I just gave you. Let's put this in other terms. If you're not used to thinking in terms of effect sizes, if you want to think about this in terms of percentile shifts, this corresponds to substitution, nearly no shift. Augmentation, a shift from about the 50th to about the 66th percentile. Modification, a shift from about the 50th to around the 80th, 79th to 80th percentile or thereabouts. Redefinition from about the 50th to about the 94th to 95th percentile. That's what you're looking at. So again, when you're trying to get a grasp on magnitude, why is there a payoff? In other words, is it just a little bit when you go to redefinition as compared to substitution? No, it's a lot more. And again, I want to emphasize that doesn't mean that doing something at substitution is bad, but it does mean that you want to, insofar as possible, wherever possible, develop the overall set of your practices. So they point more towards modification, redefinition. All right, so that was the first part, the question of individual student outcomes. The second question I had then on the table was, what else can you do with teachers in such a way as to help them develop within a school? I want to show you a couple of things in that regard. So if you can go to the next slide. What you can do is you can introduce a second model that I've developed. It's called the EdTech Quintet. The EdTech Quintet says, okay, there's lots of technologies. Which are the ones that matter the most? Which are the ones that have the most powerful proven outcomes? And I've got, all of these slides have references if you want to find out more about how this research was conducted. I was leveraging the work of the Horizon Project, et cetera, and what some of these numbers, like those strange 200,000 years, I didn't realize the iPad had been out that long. Or maybe it's Chromebooks have been out that long? Either way. But there are connections to certain historical processes, et cetera. And I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to introduce the idea of saying, well, you're working with teachers, and teachers are confronted by this huge array of technologies. How do you tell them what is most powerful, what they want to focus on? And also, from your perspective as well, what type of tool range do you want to make sure you have available on the machines? What type of experiences do you want to make possible through the tool sets available on the laptops or tablets or whatever it is you're using? So the 5 categories are social tools. These are the tools we use to collaborate, communicate with each other, share what we've created, either separately or jointly, comment on, etc. So those are all the social tools. The next category is mobility tools. That refers to the fact that the devices we use don't stay put. Okay, some are more mobile than the others. A smartphone is the most mobile of all the devices, but even so, even a fairly hefty laptop is still mobile. That means as you're planning activities, you want to think about how it can be used anytime, any place. You're no longer bound to one place. You don't have to go to the lab down the corridor because that's where the machine lives and it has to be plugged into the wall, etc. You can be thinking about experiences. Well, where do learning experiences make the most sense? Whether in time or in space, and it might not be within the school building or within the traditional school day. And you want to think about the other tools then that are associated with this, such as sensors, a camera, or an audio microphone are the simplest sensors, but of course you can measure location, temperature, etc. So all the things that allow a device to interact with its surroundings, no matter where it is, and also then ways that the device can be used to create, to explore, etc. Again, not fixed to a particular moment or location, but rather wherever it makes sense for that educational experience. The third category is visualization. We have abstract concepts, and abstract concepts are tricky to wrap your head around. So visualization tools say you can take an abstract concept and make it tangible. And by making it tangible, by being able to see it in 2 or 3 dimensions, be able to do something with it. So for instance, an abstract concept is the concept of space. Space is an abstract concept. How do we visualize space? We call it maps. And a digital map has a whole series of affordances and richness that go beyond what a paper map can do, because it can be linked to other sources, it can have layers that can be turned on or off. Time is an abstract concept. Timelines allow us to visualize time. We can also visualize connections between things. If those things that happen to be connected are concepts, we call the result a concept map. If what's being connected are animals in an ecosystem and plants, we call it a food web. If what's being connected are people in a society, we call them a social network map. But all of these are ways of visualizing the abstraction involved in connecting things. And of course, we can visualize connections or relationships between words. If you've ever used a Wordle, you've seen a way of doing it. And needless to say, we can visualize numbers with different charts, graphs, with different interactivity relative to them. Next category is digital storytelling. Digital storytelling refers to being able to use image, video, sound, music, your own voice, etc., whether in still format or over time, as in a movie might be, to tell a story. Now, the question is, why is digital storytelling powerful? Well, we tell stories to make meaning for others. By making meaning for others, we make meaning for ourselves. So digital storytelling, if you will, gives us a set of tools that allow us to make meaning for both others and ourselves, to integrate what we've learned. And finally, gaming. And what gaming allows us to do is to say, well, you have something that might be intriguing by itself, but can you add some drive to it? Can you add the desire to say, can I really push this forward? The idea of winning a game is associated with the idea of saying, well, for instance, say you have something like a city simulator, like SimCity. If you're just looking at the individual elements, you might say, well, this is how transportation interacts with buildings and roads and so on. But if I construct a game around it, and I challenge the students to say, now build me the biggest city, the richest city, the most powerful city, etc., the city most like Los Angeles, then you've suddenly created a drive that drives the student to better understand the relationship between transportation, roads, etc., to understand what's going on. And I'm therefore driving the learning process forward. So these 5 categories, social, mobility, visualization, storytelling, and gaming, the EdTech Quintet, are the particularly powerful tools. And as you're working with teachers, you want to think about to say, okay, how do you introduce them to these categories? How do you make sure they have the tools? And how do you encourage them to explore the use of the tools as they start with their first few projects? So if we can go to the next slide, this is just a summary of what I just said, so let's go one more. Okay, so you've got your teachers at your school, you're just starting out. And a lot of teachers say, I'm scared, or I've never done this, or I don't know where to start. One thing I encourage people to do is to say, look, set aside a day in your professional learning plan to get teachers into a room in groups of somewhere between 3 to 5 people. At least 3, no more than 5. That seems to be a particularly good size for this. And encourage them in those groups to work on one unit of instruction, not their entire curriculum, just pick one unit of instruction that they would like to change, that they would like to use technology to change because of one of these 3 reasons. One, the one I call your passion, is because it's something they care about deeply. It's something they think is beautiful and powerful and they think every student should get. A second option is what I call the barriers. So you're saying to teachers, look, is there a unit of instruction that really students hit and bam, it's running into a brick wall and you lose a lot of your students there? Okay, focus on using how you might use technology to change that unit of instruction. And the last option is what I call the amnesia option. It's a little bit more whimsical. I say, okay, pretend your students are going to forget, for reasons that you have no control over, so you can't change that, everything they learned in your class this year except for one thing. Now you get to pick that thing for whatever reason you like, because it's more powerful or beautiful or rich. That's up to you. But the thing is, design a unit of instruction to make sure that that one thing sticks in students' minds. These 3, I find, provide a particularly powerful or good framework for teachers to use to explore when they're trying to work in groups on this first unit of instruction to construct a SAMR ladder in terms of how they're going to use technology to change that unit of instruction. That works particularly well for 2 reasons. Number 1, any one of these 3 reasons, teachers can see the payoff. And that's something we already heard this morning, right? You want it to be high payoff, not the low payoff, easy stuff. No. All of these teachers look and say, oh yeah, I see why that matters. The second reason is that these things tend to be towards the forefront of people's thinking, towards the forefront of teachers' thoughts. So it's easier for them to undertake this, to accomplish this in terms of their first few steps in this. My experience is if you bring teachers into a room, give them about somewhere between 1 to 3 hours, and say, okay, do this in teams, My experience is before they do this, they say, oh, it's going to take me weeks, months, years to figure out how to do this. After they've done this, they say, okay, I can see how I might be able to do it. I usually ask them, what you have at the end of 1 to 3 hours is pretty rough, but can you see how to polish it? And the answer in general will be, yeah, I can see where with another weeks or so worth of work, I could polish this. So that's a good way to see how to get teachers started. So introduce them to the EdTech Quintet, set them up with this. If we go to the next slide now. One thing you would like to have happen throughout your school is to have shared practices. And by shared practices, I call these consensus practices. These are things that people agree are going to happen both within a grade level as well as across grade levels. And you've got this list over here. Again, you've got these materials available to you, so I'm not going to bore you by reading the whole list. But these are simple practices that leverage the EdTech Quintet in ways that are particularly useful, etc. So for instance, you have how everything from developing shared checklists to simple blogging, basic visualization. Let me just take one example. Let's take an example from visualization. If I agree, if a common shared practice among all teachers is going to be the use of timelines, I can start with that in K or pre-K, where kids don't even have a notion necessarily yet of what a clock is in detail, but they say, well, my day starts here, and then it goes on to here, and then it goes on here. So now when move forward a couple of years, and now they're in first, second grade, and now I can have them start to explore more the idea of time through the year, the seasons, what happens through the seasons. They get older, now we're getting more into history, and they can start exploring what a personal, historical, as opposed to on the scale of the country, as opposed to longer historical timelines look like. So I can develop this longitudinally. I can also use it within a grade. So say pick any, let's say it's 4th grade, okay? And I'm the teacher, I'm doing history, and I'm saying, well, I'm using timelines for this. And now the phys ed specialist comes along and says, oh, you know what? This is great because I want students to understand in, say, the baseball team, how the gameplay changes throughout the game. And then somebody else could say, well, this is great because I'd like also to use this for planning. So at the same time, because it's a shared practice, it can be used by multiple teachers that are involved in the work with students in a given grade. So shared practices allow you to develop forward and allow you to develop within a grade. And the beauty of this is once you have these agreed upon, once the students have developed this, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time one of these comes up. In other words, you can always say, I know students have seen timelines. I know I can build upon this. Let me develop forward. And this is a list that, as I say, over the years I've found works particularly well. Finally, if we go to the next slide, one of the other things that I find works particularly well in terms of saying, okay, so how do teachers best continue to develop their practice? How do you have a sustainable evolution of use of technology in a school? You really need 2 things. One of the things you need is a community of practice. And again, you've got the formal definition there if you want to look it up together with references. But the key thing is you want a school where teachers are, when they meet in the corridors over lunch, on a break, etc., not just for departmental meetings, okay? Not just for formal meetings, but in general, exchange tokens of their practice. Talk on what's working, what's not working, and how, so that the integration of technology is not something that every teacher does on their own or only gets talked about in a departmental meeting and that's it. But actually the evolution, the development of this, I'm using this, the example I was giving you for shared practices, etc., are things that are habitually exchanged in daily interactions. The tokens of conversation, if you will, become how am I using this, what am I doing with it, and so on. And it's important to realize, by the way, that tools such as the SAMR model, classifications like the EdTech Quintet, etc., help in this regard. Because I might have 2 teachers, say I'm in a high school. I've got the math teacher, the history teacher, and the French teacher, all talking to each other, right? And having a common language that they can use as an interpreter between their different specialties, like SAMR, like the EdTech Quintet, helps bridge that process. It helps cement, solidify the community of practice. The other aspect you want is teachers, at least a significant percentage of the teachers, not necessarily all of them, by a significant percentage to have personal learning networks. And by personal learning network, I mean each teacher reaching out for information or knowledge they will be of use in their area. And for one teacher, it might be through Facebook. For another one, it might be they go to professional society meetings and stay in email contact with other people. For other people, it might be reading blogs. For another person, it might be using Twitter as a source of information. But whatever it is, they're reaching outside the boundaries of their community for new ideas, resources, elements they're going to use. And that introduction freshens the ideas within the community. If you don't have that, you can have a very tightly knit community with a good community of practice, but it goes stale after a while. You don't have enough ideas coming in from the outside. And we know this, there have been many decades of study of this, but you can go all the way back to the 60s and Granovetter's study of what he called the strength of weak ties, where he showed that resiliency of communities and long-term stability is directly tied to these ties that go outside of the community, that bring in fresh elements, fresh components from outside the community. So this is the other component I wanted to highlight, the idea that these communities of practice and personal learning networks, if you can foster them, develop them, encourage the opportunities for them in your school, these are elements that help develop teaching practice. One last item, and I'll wrap up, which has to do with the third question I was asked, and that is, okay, so you're projecting this into the bigger community. What do you do? Well, you can see already that the first item I talked about already projected into the second, right? Because everything I talked about how to use something you already know or are using as a goal, such as web, can be used to harness it to Xamarin and in turn help develop this, and you saw what the outcomes could be. And then we talked about specific elements in terms of what happens with a teaching community. And something similar happens when you go into the parents community. So in fact, the more you can get parents and the overall community aware of elements like this, the more you can have strands of experience. You know, people always ask me, how do you get parents to buy in? Listen, the more you can get them, and I realize it can be a hard sell sometimes to get parents to show up, believe me. But the more you can get them to get their hands dirty, to set up small experiences. You know, one of the reasons I use the urban agriculture example is that's when you can explain to a parent. You don't have to get into obscure points of vocabulary development to explain how you're using technology. That might be wonderful, but it's going to be a little tricky for somebody who doesn't have a degree in education to understand it. That's an example you can show to parents and maybe have them get their hands dirty with some of the software experiences and so on. And they say, oh yeah, I get this. And you can introduce them. I've worked with schools in Vermont, for instance, that have used Xamarin to talk with students and with parents. Again, because it's simple and direct enough that they can say, oh, okay, I see what you're trying to do. So all the elements I've talked about work well in terms of bringing this to parents. But I want to show you one last set of results, which I've just had for about a month, even a little less than that, which I think are powerful in terms of addressing some concerns and moving forward. So if I can go to the next slide. Okay. How many, quick show of hands, how many people here have already looked at or seen the latest PISA results? These came out late last year, so I see a few hands. Okay. For those of you who haven't, the Organization for Economic Community Development, OECD, every so many years has what's called the PISA test, and the PISA tests are an evaluation of where countries are at in three key areas, reading, mathematics, and science, to say, okay, what's the relative level of performance? What makes the PISA results particularly unique as compared to, say, TIMSS, which is another great set of results, etc., is that PISA is calibrated by other research projects against what you expect for economic outcomes in your country. So you can tie differences in PISA results to, well, this is going to result in a net difference in a locally corrected, etc., economic outcomes for people. And this becomes very important because you're saying, if I'd like my population to overall have access to good jobs, what do they need to have in terms of being able to access that job market? So what I've done is I've analyzed the PISA results. Now, a lot of people, if we can go to the next slide, view this. This is a long list. Another quick test. Quick, tell me for Indonesia, what's the third score, right? A lot of people take the scores and view them almost as a horse race. Oh, my country is doing better than your country by 1 point, yay! That's not useful. That's not useful because in some cases you're looking at point differences that are meaningless, and then you might be doing a little better in reading, but a little worse in math. What's it all mean? That's not a good way of looking at it. So if we go to the next slide, my own approach is to say, let's look at the tests as a set and look at clusters of results. Now, one of the what I mean by a cluster are groups of countries that are performing a certain way. And one of the nice things about doing a good cluster analysis is instead of saying, well, tell me the top 10%, well, why 10? Why not 9 or 11, right? I can just say, tell me how many logical clusters this develops into, and this is the result that I get from my own analysis. If anybody wants, I can explain afterwards how I do it, but the key element is you no longer have a simple, okay, country number 1 to etc. You have groups of countries that, yes, some perform better, and you go down the list to others that perform worse. The United States is in the third group, the green group, but we also have information about some other subsets of the US. We have information about Massachusetts, North Carolina, and Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, we don't have detailed information about the other states. And you'll notice that Massachusetts performs above where the United States does. In other words, it looks more like a country in group 2. Puerto Rico, on the other hand, performs more like a country in the same group as Brazil, Peru, Jordan, Georgia, and Indonesia. So the bottom line is this allows you to start saying, well, if we have groups of countries that perform a certain way, why? What do they have in common? What do they have that's different? And why? And one of the interesting things is if I look at that top group, there are very different styles of teaching. So anybody who says, oh, it's because of how Singapore does math or how Finland doesn't do preschool, etc., those are not commonalities. But you know 2 commonalities in that top group? 1, high respect for teachers. In every single one of those countries, teachers are highly respected. That's one important one. Number 2, they're not scared to take risks. In every single one of those countries in the top group, they have not had the same education system decade in, decade out. They've been willing to take risks. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but they've been willing to experiment. Those features, those 2 are consistently present in the top group. They are not consistently present anywhere else. And I could make other comparisons, etc. Fine. So I've got that. Why am I going to this? Because I want to show you a couple of interesting results that I've found based on how students use technology in these country groups. So if we go to the next slide, there's a question that's part of PISA. So during a typical day, how long do you use the internet outside of school, right? And you have everything from no time up to more than 6 hours. And you have, this is in Singapore, the distribution. And we could say, well, one of the concerns that people have is screen time and how long kids are on. Remember, this is not for schoolwork alone. This is everything. This is Facebook. This is everything in the world, okay? So we can say, okay, so how does this relate to scores? And this is what we get if we go to the next slide. The dotted lines are the averages for math, reading, and science. What I will point out is those students that spend no time or very low amounts of time score consistently lower than the average than those students who spend more time. In fact, you find that the optimum is somewhere in between 1 and 2 hours, between 2 and 4 hours. Then it starts to drop off, and if it's more than 6 hours, yeah, that's too much. So you start to see a pattern here that allows you to say, okay, students are getting something from the internet that affects their scores, even if it's not oriented towards classwork. So we have a positive impact. There is a value to what students are getting. Let's go to the next slide, though, because you might say, okay, Ruben, but that's Singapore. That's the top score. Maybe they're really weird kids, and they're the only ones in the world. So, of course, I do this for other countries, and I do it for, since I told you Puerto Rico is more like Brazil, fine, let's do it for Brazil. Very different curve you'd expect it for socioeconomic reasons. Let's see what happens in the next screen. Lower numbers, but the pattern is much the same, except that, if anything, it's shifted actually a little more towards the right, towards spending more time. You know, more than 6 hours is still not great, but the overall curve is clearly in the direction of somewhere between 2 and 4 and 4 and 8, 4 and 6 hours. So I'm seeing this pattern. But wait, you could say, but Ruben, here's what's probably happening. It's a socioeconomic effect. All the kids scoring well are from higher socioeconomic status. All the kids scoring poorly are from low socioeconomic status. Fine. So we need a marker for socioeconomic status. Now we could use money, and I have used it, income, but let's use something else. Let's use the number of books that a child has in their home. That's a double indicator because it's both how much money do you have to buy books, but also how many of these cultural objects do you have. So let's go to the next slide. And here's what you see. No matter where you are socioeconomically in Singapore, the curve looks essentially the same. In the last one, you have missing columns because there isn't enough data. There aren't enough people in those brackets. Is it the same in Brazil? Let's go to the next slide. Yes, it is. In other words, this is telling you something very important about what I would call baseline use. So when people tell me about one-to-one, well, no, let's keep it at school because we want it just used for school because otherwise they're wasting their time. And if they're wasting their time, they go, cool down, folks. This is telling me no. Independent exploration is valuable. One-to-one, in terms of what kids can get out of it, is valuable because it opens up possibilities that are not necessarily framed in traditional schoolwork, but still have value. Now, what if we do look at traditional schoolwork? So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is how often do you use a computer for browsing the internet. Again, these are the percentages in Singapore. Go to the next one. And lo and behold, you can see that there's value for using the computer. This is just one of many questions that have been asked. I'm just showing you the simplest one, how you often use it for browsing. And you'll notice that somewhere in the almost everyday to everyday is the domain. And again, that's something you need a one-to-one program for. That's something the child needs to have access to a technology regularly for. If they only have it occasionally, you see things drop off. If you see it never or hardly ever outside of school, notice how far below the averages are for the results. Again, let's make sure Singapore isn't weird. Let's see what happens in Brazil. Those are the percentages. Next slide. Once again, you see that. Now you see that there's more of a drop-off towards every day. And there you do see a socioeconomic effect. If you're asking students to do something every day, you say a computer, but they don't have access to a computer every day, then you're beginning to impose a penalty. So this is yet another case for why you want to make sure that from an equity perspective, you're there. So that's the third aspect I wanted to show you. So for when you look at the overall picture for how you incorporate the devices into the broader perspective with parents, this is yet another piece of the puzzle. And for the last slide, again, you've got access to all of this, but if you'd like to contact me, and that's my blog, email, Twitter account. So at this point, I want to thank you all for your time, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
So without further ado, I'd like to invite my friend and colleague and Chief Technology Officer of Fairfield Sassoon Unified School District, Tim Gurry.
Thank you. That was really nice, Micah. Appreciate that. When we had that conversation, the seriousness of it for Micah was coming through the phone. It was palpable. I think that conversation, actually, I know that conversation actually ended in a prayer because he was so distraught about how he was going to do this for his school district, and I really felt for him. But he has done it, and that's been really exciting to watch from my view as a director of technology for a large school district like Fairfield. We have 22,000 students and 30 schools. We had gone a long way towards one-to-one at the time that Mike and I started talking about that. And because Mike is at a smaller school district, he's surpassed me, just like that. So he got it going, and now all their kids have devices. And I can't say that about my district yet, but you know, it takes a little longer in a big district like that. But it's a joy and a pleasure to be able to work with people like Micah who have the emotion, the passion behind what they're doing, and they know that what they're doing really matters. The presentation I want to bring you today is something I think a little unique, a little different. You probably won't hear this anywhere else. I am an IT guy. I grew up in this field as an IT guy. I had no intention at the beginning of my career over 20 years ago to work in schools. My hope was that I could be a computer programmer and eventually a managed application software manager for a company like Microsoft. That was my aspiration, and along the way, while I was doing my getting my bachelor's degree done, I took a job just to get through as a technician for the Kern High School District in Bakersfield. And at that job, I was fortunate to work for a director, an educational director at the district office, and 2 teachers on special assignment I worked with on some special projects that I did. And those 3 guys mentored me. They showed me why my skills were needed in education and helped me fall in love with the educational mission and really changed my life in an important way. And so here I am today, and one of the specialties that I have that I often speak about is how to use IT people properly in the educational mission, how to engage your IT team in the educational mission, and how to quite honestly keep them honest, because sometimes you're told no, and you have this sneaking suspicion that it's possible, right? You've heard that other districts are doing this, but your IT person's like, nope, can't be done. Nope, don't want to do that. And so about 1.5 years ago, I was called upon by a guy named John Carippo. Anybody in here know who John Carippo is from Q? John is a crazy guy. He doesn't speak the language that most of us speak. Those who know John well say that John speaks Caripponese, which is a completely different language. And you have to spend a lot of time with John to really understand where he's coming from. He's got all kinds of crazy ideas popping out of his head all the time. And he's always wanting to try to do something new and make a big impact on education. And about 1.5 years ago, he came to me and he said, I want, if you've ever heard of the Q Rockstar camps for teachers, John was a big part of making that happen about 7-8 years ago. And he wanted to start an admin version, a leadership version of Q Rockstar camps. And he asked me if I would come and help create the curriculum for that camp and be on the team that would start that. And so I said, well, okay, what do you want to do? What are we going to talk about? What do I have to bring? And he said, well, I want you to put together something that helps principals and superintendents of small districts especially to really keep their IT people honest. I'm like, what do you mean by that? And he says, well, you know how you're not that guy. You do everything you can to try to get the educational mission done. You marshal your folks and you use your IT expertise to really get things done in education. But he said, there's a lot of people who don't do that in IT in schools. And I said, yeah, I know that. And he said, well, how do we give in an 1.5 hour workshop principals all the tools they need to keep their IT people honest? I said, I don't know. Well, let's work on it. So we put together what I'm calling Earn Your IT Decoder Ring. This is a shortened version of it because we don't have an 1.5 hours. But one of the things that I found very early on in the process of putting this together and just giving some tips that you can use right away in your, and I think teachers in the room will also be able to take a lot of these things away and use them in their dealings with the IT people in their environment. Is at the end of this presentation, there's a link. It's a Google Slides presentation. I'll give you the link to where you can get to the presentation itself. And then in the presentation, there's actually a link to a document that you can take away with you. It's a companion guide that we developed that really goes into detail. So I'm going to kind of brush on a lot of subjects as we go across this next hour, but really the detail is in the document. So I want to make sure you know that I'm giving you that you can take that away with you and then come back to me later via email or Twitter or whatever and ask questions if you have any questions about that. So we developed this, and this really is, if you hit the next slide, is really the school to home edition, right, of Earn Your IT Decoder Ring. And it's really more of a focus on engaging your IT team, because what I found is as we'll see, that most of the issues that educators have with their IT folks are actually human issues, right? They're not technical issues. They're, I don't understand where you're coming from issues and why you are the way you are issues. Because IT people are a little different, right? So if you'll go to the next slide, we'll get right into this. First of all, I think one of the important things you have to understand is what motivates IT people. If you understand what motivates them, what gets them excited, and you can connect for them those key motivators to the educational mission that you have, then what you're going to find is a lot more success and a lot better relationships with your IT people. What you'll find is that they'll be willing often to go the extra mile and do the extra work to get done what you need them to get done. So the first thing is logical decision making. IT folks really like to be led by somebody who's a logical decision maker, who they can understand the thinking process of that person. They could be led by teachers, they could be led by principals, they could be led by a director of technology, could be any number of those types of people, but they want them to be logical decision makers. Doesn't mean you have to know anything about IT, okay? You don't have to know anything about IT, but you have to show yourself as a logical decision maker. Nobody that I know has ever said, will ever admit that they are not a logical decision maker, right? You don't make a decision and think, well, that's not logical, but I'm going to make it anyway, right? Everybody thinks they're a logical decision maker, and the reality is most of the time you are going through a thought process that is logical. The trick here is making sure that your thought process is transparent and viewed by the IT folks. There are a lot of people out there who don't need to know what you're thinking or how you got to your idea. IT people do. They need to know that what you're thinking, that your progress, your process through that thinking process is logical. So the answer to how you make sure that they know that you're making logical decisions is to communicate the big picture with them all the time. So they're a group of people who really need to know what's the big picture, what are you trying to get at, and how do they fit in to that? What can their skills do to get you to where you want to be? So sharing things that details that may not even seem like they would be interested, you'll find that if you do that on a regular basis, they'll get more bought into the big picture. And then they'll start thinking, well, maybe I can do this to help you with the big picture, right? So share the big picture often. Second one is elegance and simplicity. IT people love things to be elegant. They love systems, and more often than not, great systems are elegant and even simple, right? Is there anything about the educational system that is elegant and simple? Honestly, think about it. I mean, education is a messy process. And as educators, what I've found over the years is that many of you thrive on that mess, right? You actually enjoy this process of getting in, digging your hands in, and helping students get to where they need to be. And that's not a simple process, and it's not an elegant process. Sometimes it's downright ugly. But many of you as educators are comfortable with that. I want to tell you, most of the IT people are not comfortable with that. So what are the things you have to think about as an educator to try to tie your IT person in to the educational mission is really think about how can I make sure that the process we're going through is simple and transparent to them so that they can see what it is that you're doing. So we talked a little bit about that in the logical decision making, but the best way to help them deal and grapple with the messiness that school is to give them opportunities to help make your process better. So one of the things that I'll tell people often that I find most people don't realize is that your technology person is first and foremost a process person. They are very good at taking any process, whether it has to do with technology or not, and trying to finding the straightest line between point A and point B, right? So they're good at refining processes, finding flaws in processes, and creating new processes that get you to where you want to go quickly and efficiently. So let them do that. Get them involved in planning processes at your school or in your district, even when that planning process doesn't necessarily have to do with technology. Because when you do, when you give them the opportunity to be on that planning team, say your next curriculum adoption, right? Then they get an opportunity to get a back, the back door sort of inside look on what you're doing as an educator. And then they start processing. Usually they have to go home at night and sleep on it, but they'll come back and they'll start shooting out ideas. I saw what you guys were doing with this thing over here when we were in our meeting the other day, and I really give that some thought, and I think it might be a good idea to cut this piece out and just go straight from here to there. And the way you can deal with that is by using this technology and to streamline this process. They'll do that on their own if you give them the opportunity to be involved in planning. So I would highly recommend you do that. Automation of manual tasks and learning and growing are both connected in this context. IT people really like to be able to automate things that are, quite frankly, boring and mundane, right? My mother used to laugh at me when I was a teenager because I started getting into programming and building computers back then. And I would spend hours upon hours upon hours with, and tons of effort to create a program that would do a simple menial task, because I didn't want to do the simple menial task over and over and over again. Right? She would call me lazy because I didn't want to do the task that I needed to do, right? But I wasn't lazy. I just really wanted to not do that task, and I was willing to work really hard to create a process so I didn't have to do that task ever again, right? And you'll see that a lot of times in your IT folks. That sort of streak, you'll think, wow, they kind of have this lazy sort of feel to them, right? But really, they're not interested in doing menial things. They want to learn all the time. They want to grow all the time. They want to be doing new things, innovative things, interesting things. And that's where when they tap into that interest and that passion, that's when they get really excited and they get energetic and they'll work really hard. So allow them to automate the things around your school and your district that are menial, especially that have to do with their jobs. If they come and say, I think I can do that, I find a way to do this better, let them do it. Let them spend the time to do that and let them learn and grow. I think one of the things that you'll find too is, if you really think about it, is even in an educational organization, your IT people are likely the best learners in the organization. They don't need a class to go to and learn something, right? They don't need even a book. They will go out and hunt the information they need down, kill it and eat it for dinner. They love to learn all the time, but they don't learn the way that school typically wants people to learn. So you have to recognize that, but give them opportunities to learn and grow. If they stagnate, you get one of two things. Either your good people, if they're stagnating, will leave, and you don't want your good people to leave. Or your marginal people, if they're not learning and growing, will do less and less and less until they're ineffectual in your organization. And you don't want that either. We can go to the next slide. So here's where it gets real. And I don't want to offend anybody, but I'm going to make sure that you understand, because I think a lot of people do these things and they don't even realize they're doing it, or that it's something that's incredibly irritating to their IT staff. And I'm going to say some things that I'm sure you've heard before as we go through this, but the first one is really important. How many times are your IT people stopped in the hallway and the first thing that's said to them is, "I have a problem," right? It's not like a normal person, right? It's not like, "Hey, how was your weekend? How are your kids?" Right? How's your wife or husband doing? No. The first thing you say to them as you stop them in the hall frantically is, "My computer won't boot up," right? And when you're doing that, honestly, you're not acknowledging the fact that they're a human being. And I know it seems like a little thing because you have a problem and you need to deal with it right now. But the reality is, if they're getting that from every staff member at your school site on a regular basis, it really wears on them after a while. It really does. And they are likely not to feel like they're a part of your team over a period of time if they feel like they're just a tool to be used by you instead of a human being. So make sure that in all of that you're doing, the things that you would do if you're a principal for your teachers, make sure you're doing those kinds of things for IT people too. Acknowledge their humanity. I mean, I've gotten this from my mother. I get a phone call. I haven't talked to my mother in 2 weeks, and I got a phone call the other day from my mom, and there it is on my cell phone. I pick it up and, "Hey, Mom, how's it going?" She's all, "Pretty good. Hey, I have a computer problem." Seriously. I haven't talked to my mother in 2 weeks, and it's not, "How are the kids? How's your wife? How are you doing, son?" No, it's, "I have a computer problem." So, just give that some thought. I cannot tell you how many times as an IT person I have been in a situation where I've been told that we're going to do something that I had no involvement in the planning process for. And as I get into what has already been purchased for me to implement, there are all kinds of problems with the thing we purchased that isn't going to work in our environment. And this piece, this not getting IT people involved in the planning of your big initiatives, especially your one-to-one initiatives at the very beginning, and allowing them to have a voice, is really a crusher for your IT people. It basically says you have no respect at all for them as people and for their input. Now, we're going to address some other things. I understand that sometimes there are situations where there have been interactions with your IT folks that make it so that you're not sure you want them at the planning table. And that's something else to address entirely. But that's actually not an excuse. You've got to get them involved in planning at the beginning because they do have information that you're going to need to know as you're making purchases and planning and implementation that could make or break the entire thing. So you've got to get them involved in planning. And then blaming them. We're systems. Okay, so how many times have you seen an interaction or been involved in an interaction? I know I have a lot where the assumption when something goes wrong is that IT changed something and that's what broke it, or the system is broken, right? I could tell you 90% of the time when I get a help ticket, our staff gets help tickets, and what they're getting is Aries, our student information system's not working correctly. It was working yesterday, now it's not. What did you guys do? Or Aries is not working again, this system sucks, right? And maybe the system does suck. I'm not saying it doesn't, okay? I'm not saying it does, I'm not saying it doesn't, but blaming the system or blaming the IT support person for the problem when you start saying, here's what the problem is not a good idea. Because we have the data, I'll tell you this right, this is absolute truth. We have the data that shows that about 90% of the problems are user error. Okay? Even if you don't believe that, that's okay. If you don't believe that, I totally get it. I understand. But that's what your IT people believe, right? So you're going to immediately start your interaction with your IT folks on a bad foot, right? By saying, what did you do to break this system? But the reality is, most of the time, you know, a calm IT person, somebody who does a good job, is going to come, have the bedside manner that they need to have. They're going to ask the probing questions, and they're going to get down to the problem. And most of the time, it's, you know, somebody's doing something a little incorrectly, or maybe the interface has changed, but not because the IT person did something wrong, just because things change, right? And so blaming them, blaming systems right off the bat, not a good idea. Honestly, you would go a long ways to create a better relationship with your IT folks if you were able to start all your conversations or all your help tickets with, maybe it's me, but here's what's going on. I'm not quite sure. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. I'm telling you, if you would do that, if you would start it, like, even if you know for sure, right? Even if you know for sure that it's not you, right? Just starting going, you know, it could be me. I think I might be making a mistake. Could you help me try to figure out this problem? I'm not quite sure what I'm doing wrong. And if the IT person finds out it's a system issue, I guarantee the IT person's going to go, you know what, I'm sorry, something's not right with this, and we're going to fix it. It's not you. And if it is you, they're going to be a lot more gracious too. So, you know, that's just a tip. Start out, you know, assume that it's you. You've nothing to lose but just a tiny bit of pride. And it really helps your relationship a lot with your IT people. Okay. How many people have your IT people start every conversation when you say, I have a problem with technology, and the first thing they say back to you is, can you put in a ticket? Right? And that's annoying, right? It's irritating. You're like, well, this ticket system is just one more layer of bureaucracy that I have to go through. And here I am trying to save the world and help kids, and you're telling me to put in a ticket. Really? Right. I understand. However, there's a reason we have ticket systems, okay? There's a couple of reasons, really good reasons, why we have ticket systems that you need to understand. One is, if all of our issues are in tickets, we can quantify on a regular basis what work we're doing. And we can more effectively, especially me in my position as a director, I can more effectively lobby the superintendent and the CBO for more staff if I can show the amount of work that we're doing. That work that doesn't go into a ticket system is work that we can't prove we did. So if you think you need more IT staff for support at your school, make sure all your problems go into the ticket system, right? Because that really helps them get a good sense of what's really happening out there. We know a lot of IT people do a lot of don't even do, you know, they do work that never goes in the ticket system. In a sense, you're really disservicing your IT person because their bosses never get a sense of the amount of work they really do. So if you could think of it that way, it sure would help. And so if you come to the conclusion that, yeah, it's a good thing to go ahead and use ticket systems and make sure you're putting all that work in, then don't complain about how long it takes to solve a problem when you never put a ticket in the first place for it. So I can tell you how many times I get a phone call at my level from a teacher or a principal who says, I've been waiting for 2 months for this thing to get done, and I'm done. I've had it with waiting. I need it done now. And they may have been waiting for 2 months. But when I go in the ticket system and they put the ticket in 2 days ago, how are we supposed to know, right? So a lot of times I find that it's things like that. They seem like little things, but they really make a big impact on the relationship that you can have with your IT folks. So make sure you put those tickets in right away, because if you put those tickets in, now you've got a record. And if it does wait 2 months to get fixed, you've got it on the record that it's been waiting 2 months, and now that discipline can happen, whatever needs to happen, can happen to deal with that. But when you get that situation where you haven't correctly reported the problem, then it makes it difficult for us to fix it. So just give that some thought. Let's go to the next slide. Here's some common conflicts that we run into when we're dealing with one-to-one programs especially. Boy, I woke up with bad throat. I apologize. I'd probably choke on it, honestly. But thank you. I appreciate that. So often we'll find that that educational staff feel like the IT people are demanding too much control over devices. Often we have complaints about wanting to lock down a device so that it can only do certain things, so it can't do the bad things that you wouldn't want kids to be doing, that sort of thing. Here's an idea that I want to propose to you, is that most IT people will be willing to let go of some of those demands, if not all of those demands of control, if you can show that there's good accountability on the back end when somebody does something they shouldn't do with the technology. Okay, so here's what I mean. What I found is that as I've talked to IT people, because I often go into other districts and get to consult with them and help them through some of the issues that they're having from a process perspective. And what I often find is there's that complaint. The IT people want too much control. We need more freedom so that the kids can do what they need to do on the devices. And then when you go talk to the IT person says, every time kids do something that they shouldn't be doing, there are no consequences. And so I feel like I need to have control on the front end to make up for the fact that there doesn't seem to be any accountability on the back end. And I find that kind of interesting. So often then you'll go back to the educational folks and you'll find out there is accountability on the back end, but the IT person doesn't see it, right? They're not clued into the process. So one of the things that I would suggest, if you're having that issue of feeling like the IT people are demanding a lot of control when you don't feel like they really need that, or they're really locking things down for students in a one-to-one environment, is to get together with them and involve them in developing a standard accountability practice for the things that can go wrong and the things that kids can do that they shouldn't be doing with either the device or the internet, right? So get them involved in developing the accountability plan. Because you may already have the accountability plan, as many principals have this down pat. I mean, they know how to deal with discipline. They do it every day. Many of them have gotten to the point where even the technology stuff, they treat it like every other kind of discipline in their school, which they should. But the IT people often don't see that. So you may have a plan already, but sit down with your IT people and say, I'm concerned, I'm wondering if maybe some of the control that you want to have on the front end is because you're not sure that students are being held accountable for what they're doing on the back end. Can you help me develop a plan to make sure that we are keeping people accountable? And if we do, would you be willing to loosen the reins a little bit on control on the front end? And you might find that IT people are really open to that idea. So then you just develop that plan together, then that you've exposed, here's what you're going to do. Then when you actually go through that process of disciplining a student for something that they've done having to do with technology, if the IT person has at all been involved in that process of finding out that the kid did it, because often they are, right? Like they'll be the one to tell you that the logs from the internet are showing these kids going to these websites and they shouldn't, or they're the one to find out, to look and see that this is happening, or to be called in to research and see if the cache on the computer is showing certain things. If they're involved at all in the process of finding out that something has gone awry, then make sure you follow up at the end of the process and let them know what you did to hold that student accountable. And what you'll find, I think, is the IT people will start going, okay, I feel better that what should be happening is happening. So now I can let go of some of the control on the front end, feeling like that's not their responsibility anymore. And then the second thing that we often run into is we'll have IT people saying, we can't do this or that because it's against the law. Have any of you heard of that? Heard your IT people say, we can't open up this website because it's against Child Internet Protection Act? No? Well, you guys are so advanced. Really? Have you heard that a little bit? Okay, so I mean, sometimes you have a situation like that where IT people say, nope, can't do it, it's against the law. First of all, make sure you actually read the law. Ask them what law is it that's against, and then go read the law. Because what we find a lot, I find, as an IT administrator, I go and speak a lot at the SETPA conference, and SETPA is sort of the preeminent organization in California for helping technology people in schools, at best practices and that sort of thing. And we have a lot of IT people in schools out there who are absolutely convinced that certain things are against the law when they're just not. Okay? And it's because they've heard from somebody else on a listserv, or they went to a conference and somebody said something and they misunderstood, or, they're all perpetuating this idea that this interpretation of the law that's very stringent. So I would highly recommend you just read the law, because what you'll find is that in most of the laws that have to do with restrictions on what you can do on the internet with students, especially, the board of your school district almost always has the power. Meaning, the law will say something along the lines of, you must have a filtering solution in place. It doesn't say what you have to filter other than broad categories of pornography, which is obvious. You want to filter that stuff. But beyond that, it doesn't really say. And then when you get to the bottom of the text of the law, what it almost always says is, these things are basically defined by the Board of Education of the school district. So if you put forth a policy at your school district level and explain it well and get it passed by your board, you have a lot of freedom. You can do a lot of things, right? You can do almost anything you want to do if your board approves of it. Almost anything. So all of these things about, we can't buy, what was mentioned last night that I thought was impressive was the school district being willing to help students purchase low-cost internet access at their homes. Not a lot of school districts are doing that. And honestly, I think most of the time it's because they think that they're going to get crosswise with the law somehow by doing that. Are they able to guarantee that those internet connections are filtered if those internet connections are being provided by the district, right? Those are things that I think a lot of school districts immediately say, we can't do that. But the reality is, if you have a friendly board to technology and has a visionary idea about this, or you can help infuse that to the board as a leader in your organization, you can write policies that will allow you to do those things. Okay, so very few times in the law does the law say, you as a school district cannot do this. Very few times. Almost always leaves it up to the board. So if the board has the power, then you as a leader in your organization have the power to influence your board and write a policy that they can pass that will allow you to do the things you think are right for your students. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. Doing pretty good. All right. So I just want to go over a few things in general that we have found in our school district that have helped us with successful one-to-one implementations. Like I said, not every school in our district is one-to-one yet, but we do have 10 schools out of our 30 that are completely one-to-one take-home, where we provide all the devices and they take them home every day. So that's a big deal for us. That is where we want our entire district to be eventually, and we're working toward that goal. We started that process using mostly one-time funds. So in the last few years, our school districts have received a lot of one-time funds. That is now tapering off, and those who haven't had a plan as they've been growing their base of devices to replace those devices with ongoing general funds are going to have some trouble over the next couple of years because budgets are not looking as good as they have for the last few years. So really working now as quickly as you can, if you haven't done this yet, to make sure that there is a replacement fund available that's general fund, that's not categorical, that can't go away, that, you know what I'm saying, is really, really critical, because what we talk, when we talk to our board early on about trying to do this, what I would say often to them is every device that we buy for a student today is a promise to buy another one in 3 years, and another one 3 years after that, and another one 3 years after that, forever. And so these are not one-time funds. And I think back in the late 90s and the 2000s, we often treated technology purchases as one-time purchases. And then we got ourselves into trouble with 10-year-old computers because we never had a plan to replace them on the clip that was required. So every device is a promise to purchase another device in a reasonable amount of time. And I can't tell you how important I think this is. I'm a big fan, actually it's my mission in education, to create environments that are relevant, that look like the environments that students run into outside of school. I get frustrated when we settle for less in school districts, when we say that it's okay for a computer to be 10 years old. That's not good enough for our kids. And you would never put up with that in your job, right? Doing your job. I have on my person right now, I've got 3 devices. I've got an iPad, a laptop, and a smartphone. And I wouldn't do without any of them. If I had to do without the iPad, I guess I could. But I wouldn't do without any of them. I use them all in different modes. And we're struggling just to give students one device, hoping that it'll do all the things that we want it to do, right? So that's difficult enough, but when we allow devices to get old, and we say that that's okay, honestly, I'm really ambivalent to the idea of taking donations from companies of devices that are 2 years old, because that's not good enough. Kids deserve new devices. And they should have devices that work well and that are relevant to the world outside of school. We don't want school to be a black hole of technology, and everywhere else kids go, even kids who struggle in their families with income issues. When they go around, they see better technology in their friends' homes and in the libraries and in the offices that they happen to be at somewhere, anywhere. At gas stations, they see better technology than some of our schools have. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. So we've got to start changing our thinking. And the way that I like to do that is to think about down at the bottom, it says devices and internet equals electricity. When we got into our budget cuts back in 2009, when things started going very badly, nobody ever came to the board in our school district and said, well, let's turn the lights off. That'll save us some money. Right? Did anybody do that? And yet, I'll tell you this, electricity on average, the cost of electric bills on average has gone up 4 to 5% every year for the last 30 years. That outpaces the cost of living by double. Easy. And yet nobody complains about it. I mean, they may complain about it, but nobody even seriously considers turning the lights out. Why? Because electricity is a utility that we have decided long ago is a right, a human right for students to have in our environment. Devices and internet have reached that place. It is a human right for students to have not just devices and internet, but access to the knowledge of the world, which is the internet, and the tools to create, collaborate, and communicate with others. They have a right to have access to that. In fact, I would say that you can't do Common Core without those things. If you look at the Common Core standards, littered throughout Common Core, you have to communicate, collaborate, and create. You have to communicate and collaborate with people outside of the classroom. How do you do that on a regular basis unless students have access to the internet and devices whenever they need it, right? So I think overall the formula for one-to-one success at the end of the day is starting to think of these services as utilities that people must have. And you carve out the money for it, even if you have to get rid of other things and other programs that, frankly, many of which have been with us 30 or 40 years and may be irrelevant if we look at them closely. And replace some of those things with something that is relevant and is not going away ever. And that's this kind of access. So once you switch your thinking and you've got that in your mind and you're looking at it that way, it gets a lot easier to find the funds to do these things. And then finally, network infrastructure, super important. You really can't roll out a successful one-to-one program unless your wireless and your physical network are top shape. So you have to put the money and the work into that to make sure that that's good. If you're running around with a bunch of devices but you can't get on the internet, I mean, some of these devices are fairly useless without the internet these days. So give that some thought. And then support staff. That's where most of your money comes from for budget for IT. It's not an easy sell sometimes in some school districts, but come up with a formula. I'll tell you the way we did it in our district was I sat down with our superintendent early on in this process, and she was absolutely bent on making sure that every student had a device and had access. And so we started talking about what does that environment look like. We didn't have a wireless network yet. Kids didn't have devices other than shared devices in labs. And so we sat down and I said, well, what do you think the end goal of that looks like? And she said, well, every kid's got a device and they're taking them home every day and they've got to have, the right kind of backpacks to store them in or sleeves or whatever. And they've got to have good wireless access because they can't be plugging those things into the walls all the time. And so we were talking about all those things. And I said, what does support look like for that? And, if you look at an elementary school that has 500 or 600 or 700 kids, that's going to mean they're going to have 500 or 600 or 700 devices running around that school, right? How much tech time do you think it's going to take to properly support those? And she's like, we'll probably need a full-time tech even at an elementary school, just at an elementary school. And then I knew I had her, right, at that point. So I said, I agree. We need a full-time tech at every school, if we're in that environment. And so we created a plan that every time we bought lumps of devices, we increased our tech staff on a ratio. So, and I didn't allow the purchase of the devices until we got that tech staff justification approved. And that's how we grew our department to a place where now when I talk to other IT directors in other school districts and they ask me how many staff I have, they're like, are you kidding me? How did you get that many people? We just grew it based on the number of devices that we were putting out there. And the number of the proliferation of devices is pretty extreme. You know, it's 6 years ago, we had 5,000 devices in our district total. That includes staff. Today, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 22,000 devices. And so you can't add that amount of devices without adding some staff as well to support that. Otherwise, if the teachers don't feel like they can get a problem solved quickly when they have it, can you really expect them to integrate the technology into their lessons? Probably not, right? It's not really fair. So let's go on to the next slide. And then this is the last thing that I wanted to kind of touch on, and then we'll be done. This is an idea that we came up with in our district, I think is fairly unique. We have this problem in schools, and it's called the expectation that everything be running perfectly on the first day of school. And we want to start everything for the first time also on the first day of school, right? And it makes sense. If you're talking from a curriculum perspective, it does make sense. Why? Because usually you want to give teachers the summer to think about what they're changing in their practice, right? So that when they hit the first day of school, they've got this plan for the whole year, a curriculum plan for the whole year of what they're going to do. But with technology, especially one-to-one implementations for the first time, would like you to kind of think about doing it a little differently. Here's why. While we do start those new curriculum, like new textbooks and that sort of thing on the first day of school, teachers always in those situations have the opportunity to review that curriculum a year ahead of time, or at least the spring ahead of time, right? Many of them have had the opportunity to pilot those things in their classroom and see what's different about it. Then they have the summer to think about what it is that they've seen and how it will impact their new class that they have the next year. We need to kind of create that same situation whenever we're doing a brand new one-to-one implementation. And so what we've done in our district, and it helps even out the workload, by the way, for the tech staff too, because summers are brutal for tech staff. And the first 2 months of school are brutal for the tech staff. They can spend all their time just holding people's hands and helping them getting up and running. If they have to do implementations, first-time implementations at the same time, your support's not going to be very good, right? And so what we did was we started saying, okay, whenever you want to do a new one-to-one implementation at your school, that order for those devices has to go in by the end of January the previous year. So if you want it to start on the first day of school in August, the order has to actually be in January. We won't implement on the first day of August. We'll implement in the spring. We'll make the purchase at the end of January, beginning of February. We'll implement in March or April. And at the end of the year, March, April, May, the teachers get an opportunity to actually see what having devices in their classroom does to their management style, to their curriculum, what they can do. And they get to see it with kids that they've had already all year long, right? Kids that they know, right? So they can see that when they introduce these devices, here's the things that change. Then they get all summer to think about that, and they come back hitting the ground running, already seeing what it looked like in their classroom the year before. That evens out the tech staff work because in that February, March, April timeframe is actually the least busy time usually for tech. And it also forces administrators to plan earlier. One of the things that I really like about this, that I think has been one of the big benefits from it, is that I used to get the question from principals at school sites who were doing a new program or wanting to purchase something. I would get it the week before the purchase deadline in May, and that question would sound something like, what can I get for $10,000? What can I get for the $5,000 I have left in my budget, right? And what I found is, as we have said no, they always want everything to start on the first day of school, right? So they say, no, if you want to start on the first day of school, you have to actually put that order in January. Now I'm getting questions in November, and the questions sound like, because they've got most of their budget still left, the questions now sound like, what's the best technology I can get for this educational purpose? Totally different question, right? What can I buy with the money I have left over versus what should I buy to accomplish this educational purpose? Totally different question. And it is absolutely just asking that question, moving up that deadline, and asking that question earlier than a year, and principals using the first fruits sort of their budget, and planning early what they really want to accomplish has absolutely transformed our ability to do great one-to-one implementations, because now the principals are doing proper planning from the beginning. So just give that some thought. If you want to know more information on how that could work in your district, if you aren't doing something like that, please let me know. If you could flash forward to the next slide, to the next one again. There's the slide. If you click on that picture on the right-hand side, that's the companion guide that has all the details written out, and even more information than I gave you today. And if you'll go to the next slide, there's my information. If you'd like to get in touch with me via Twitter or email, there's my email. And then that link at the very bottom, that shortened Google link, is the link to this presentation. It's a Google Slides, and I'm happy to let you use it for whatever you want. You can download it and edit it and use it in your own district if you'd like, if that helps at all. Do I have time for questions? Am I done? I'm done. So thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks, Micah. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you, Sonny. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today. As I look at the work that you're doing and listening to people talk at the tables, I think if the governor were here, he would say, this is what we're trying to accomplish. There is a new philosophy in California, and the philosophy is, if poor kids of color are going to be rescued, they're going to be rescued by the people closest to them. The notion that Sacramento or Washington, D.C. can rescue kids is a preposterous notion. The rescue of poor kids of color is highly personal for me. I was that poor kid of color back when. My mom raised 6 of us by herself. She was a victim of domestic violence. The Immaculate Heart Sisters taught me to read cold turkey, no kindergarten in the 1st grade. They had high expectations for me. And I sometimes think, why did this nun, Sister Martin, work so hard to get me to read in the 1st grade like all the other youngsters who came from much more advantaged backgrounds. And I sometimes think maybe she wanted to avoid a longer term in purgatory and felt that if she could succeed with me, this might be a smoother path to heaven. There were things about Sister Martin that were really interesting. Now, I'm an old guy. This is the 1950s. They knew that when kids first come to school, there are two things that you got to get them to do. You got to get them to read, and then you've got this discipline thing. And Sister Martin was outstanding at both. So she taught me to read, but then there was the dark discipline side. So, first year in school, they're going to have this great, it's coming up next week. They're going to have this great Valentine's party for the first graders. So we're all excited. We're absolutely sky high because we know we get this great party. So we're out of control most of the morning. And she keeps saying to us, if you keep misbehaving, you're not going to get your party. Now, even though we were only 6 years old, we had enough street savvy to know the stuff had already been bought, it was there, we were going to have our party. So we stayed out of control all morning. We went to lunch, we came back after lunch, we sat down, she had everybody, they had them roll in the tray with all of our stuff on it, heart-shaped ice cream, big cookies, knee-high punch for those of you who are old enough to remember that sort of thing. And then she said, now take this and give it to the second grade because these kids have misbehaved all morning. I was in shock. And you see that I'm still traumatized by this all these years later. Fast forward about 30 years, I'm teaching a doctoral level course at the University of Pittsburgh. There's a Franciscan nun in the course. I told the Sister Martin story. At the end of that year, I left and went back to Southern California. Comes Valentine's Day, a big, huge package arrives from Mrs. Fields, and it says, Carl, we're not all the same, get over it. As you see, I've been struggling to get over this. But what they did for me is the same thing that you're doing for kids, and it makes no difference whether it's a parochial school, a charter school, a traditional public school. Someone importantly decided that this poor kid of color is going to get the requisite skills in order to be successful. And that's what happened to me. At the time, poor kid of color, dysfunctional family, who knew that that person would lead the second and third largest school systems in California and become the federal court monitor for the consent decree in Los Angeles. And so I salute you for creating those bright futures for the generation of youngsters that you're serving today. I also think it's incredibly smart closing the digital divide and involving parents in that. That's the ultimate in terms of what we're trying to do and accomplish. It was Robert Kennedy in the ESEA hearings back in 1965 who first argued the parents of poor kids can be vital contributors to their education. I look at my own mom. You know, sometimes today we get into this, well, you know, these poor parents, they're so lame. They couldn't figure out what a good school is without the state telling them what a good school is. If you told my mom that, my mom who had a 6th grade education, that she couldn't recognize what a good school is without the state of California telling her what it, she would have been horrified by that. She knew exactly what she wanted, and I'm arguing that the parents of poor kids, some of whom might not have as much formal education as others, have the highest aspirations for their kids. And you're linking them to the positive changes that are taking place in classrooms today is incredibly important work. Are you going to advance my slides? Go ahead. And so this big change that we're talking about, and this is why your job today is much tougher than a few years ago. We are asking the schools and school districts to make change on a monumental scale. This historic legislation that the governor signed changes school finance, but it also changes governance. And some people are missing the governance part. And I'm arguing that you're actively involved in the governance part. That link to families and homes, that's what the governor was talking about in terms of governance change. Some people look at this and go, oh, it just means that local school boards are now in charge and that's the governance change. No, it's getting to the stakeholders who are actually with the kids. That's the big governance change. You all know about the new standards, both Common Core, Next Generation Science Standards. You all know about Smarter Balance and new assessments. These other two things have direct impacts on the classroom. We're arguing that these new approaches to school discipline are absolutely critical. For me, slowing the pipeline to prison is an incredibly important undertaking. The first district that our collaborative is working with is out in Blythe, California. How many of you have been to Blythe? A fast food or gasoline stop on the way to Arizona, right? The economy in Blythe is driven by 2 state prisons. And I'm seeing a pattern now that I get out from my urban bubble and I'm working with the whole state, right? The state figured out, you know, without an uprising of the locals, the only way we can locate these prisons is out in geographically isolated places. So when we start working with a district, we spend time there trying to learn about folks at the local level, what drives the economy. So we actually went and visited Ironwood State Prison. Fascinating morning. One of the things about Ironwood, they have a contract with the community college system. The most popular occupational area for the inmates is this particular occupational area. The contract calls for them to translate textbooks into Braille. And the reason why it's so popular is because you're guaranteed a job if you get out. And so we were listening to one of the inmate leads. We asked him, what was your schooling experience like? He said, I was growing up in South Central, single-parent household. No one paid any attention to me at the middle school level with regard to what was going on socially and emotionally with me. In order to get to school, I had to figure out how to navigate some very, very tough terrain just to get to school and get back home. And he said, I decided in order to safely do that, that I needed to join a gang. And he's an incredibly smart young man. He said, if I'm going to be in a gang, I'm going to be the leader of the gang. And so he made some bad choices as the leader of the gang. And if you actually want to see this young man, go on YouTube, TED Talks at Ironwood State Prison, and you'll actually see him talking about his experience. I'm walking around with the warden, and I asked the warden, what does it cost to house an inmate here? And he said, it's just a tad under $50,000 a year. So what we as a state are willing to pay on the back end after youngsters make poor choices, the equivalent of an Ivy League education. One of the things that was interesting about priorities, we found out from the HR person at this school district that they often lose teachers to the prison because the prison pays more than the local school district. Talk about misplaced priorities. So sometimes people look at a bullet around new approaches to school discipline, and they don't understand the economic impact if we don't get that right. And that is incredibly important in terms of the work that you're doing. And then this other of new approaches to serving students with disabilities, I chaired a statewide task force that issued its report in March of 2015. And one of the things that we suggested was that the vast majority of youngsters with disabilities ought to be educated in regular gen ed classrooms. And we're not going to get there without MTSS, Universal Design for Learning, a whole host of things that are critically important to equipping everybody to work with the challenges that youngsters are actually presenting. So next slide, please. So we were established to advise and assist. We've got this 5-member governing board, kind of put together in a political way. The neat thing about this board, they only want to meet once every 2 months. So that's a good thing. Next slide, please. Okay, somebody used White House spell check on principals. Okay, so that should be PLES. With apologies to Sean Spicer and Kellyanne Conway. We start with this idea of profound respect for the local level. And this, so I studied to be a priest just like the governor before I got into education. This is part of another principle called the principle of subsidiarity, which is about organizing at the grassroots level. that people at the local level actually have the answer. So we start with that. We also argue that community stakeholders, including parents, are critically important. We're committed to the improvement process, but it has to be owned by those at the local level. We're not going to do anything to or for an LEA, but we're going to work with. And it's really interesting when we go to these places, everybody sort of goes, okay, you're from the state. You know, when are you going to tell us what to do? Because that's been the role since No Child Left Behind, a decade and a half of people being told what to do. Closing the achievement gap, we're focused on continuous improvement and building capacity, and we're arguing that this takes time. I'm always uneasy when people make promises about closing the achievement gap quickly. Some of the people who've actually done that are in jail in Atlanta, have lost their credentials in other places. So this is incredibly important, but I think to argue that it's a quick waving of a magic wand is disingenuous. One of the things that I note is in Long Beach, where I served as superintendent for 10 years, the big gains in student achievement kicked in years 5 through 10. And so one of the problems with our politics today, everything's driven by a 4-year election cycle. And if the Long Beach School Board had said, you know what, Carl Cohn is a nice guy, he's charming, but he's not really moving the needle. Let's get somebody else in here. Let's start on a new trajectory. So understanding that this important work actually takes time is critically important. Next slide, please. So we've got some money from the legislature. When you add it all up, we got money for training. We got money to work with pilot districts. It all added up to about $30 million, so that's what we're working with as we begin our work. Next slide, please. So part of this professional development and training around the LCAP and the rubrics consists of statewide workshops that we've had, component 1, and then component 2, you'll start hearing about aligned local trainings, support on using the LCFF evaluation rubrics and the LCAP templates as tools for continuous improvement. Some of your district level people will be involved in that. Next slide, please. Then component 3 are these deeper learning networks where you're actually using, and you'll be hearing a lot in the next few days about green and red and blue and yellow. And so this probably isn't going to sound right coming from a state person, but take all of that with a grain of salt. If the governor were here, he would say, this is not the law and the prophets. This stuff was not handed down on stone tablets on Mount Sinai. This is man-made stuff. So look at it that way. It's designed to be a conversation that begins, how can we help improve student performance? It's not designed to punish and shame. Next slide, please. Okay, so the most exciting thing that we're doing is working with these pilot districts. So part of that is getting them the technical assistance that they need to move forward, and it's not going to cost them anything. So that's kind of the good news. The state gave us the money to give to school districts. We're going to partner with them, focus very much on continuous improvement, building their capacity. We're collaborating with them and providing them the technical support. That technical support can be anything under the 8 state priorities. So if a district says, give me absolutely the best in terms of someone who knows everything about A through G requirements, improving counseling, and we say that would be Catalina Cifuentes of the Riverside County Office of Ed, blah, blah, blah. Next slide, please. And this is how we're selecting our pilots. Some have volunteered and said, we want this help. The legislature asked us to have pilots in an urban setting, a suburban setting, and a rural setting. And then identified student need, unduplicated count, which is the number of poor kids learning English, and kids in foster care, and then the whole issue of what are the existing gaps, and then our board approves them. Next slide, please. These are the places that we're working with so far, and we're probably going to have up to a dozen or so. One of the things that I find interesting, I've been an urban guy all my life, but I really am fascinated by the geographically isolated rural places and the challenges that they face in California. So when I'm out in Blythe or Greenfield in South Monterey County, where some teachers drive 100 miles from San Luis Obispo to work there, I think about the fact I was superintendent in 2 places that teachers love to live, Long Beach and San Diego. I did not have the challenges that the Blythe Palo Verde superintendent has, or Greenfield. So in some ways, I used to operate out of this conventional wisdom that the large urbans have the toughest jobs. I am rethinking that completely. And some of the smaller places, you know, we think we have politics in the big city. Try Sausalito, Marin City, if you want to see some politics. You know how many students they have there? They have 160 students in a traditional public school, and then they have a charter with 400 kids in it, and the school board members, their kids go to the charter, and the 160 kids get what's left, and the politics is unbelievable. So I'm learning a lot about our state, but as I think about it, and then I come to a place like this, and I see what you're actually doing, I know that the governor would be incredibly excited, because you are closest to the kids, and if they are, in fact, going to be rescued, it's going to be done by you. So I salute you for all that you're doing, and if there's anything that we can do to partner as you go forward, we're delighted to be a part of that. Thank you.